body of material known as Egyptian mythology emerged within a highly specific geographic and environmental context shaped by the Nile Valley and its surrounding deserts. The annual inundation of the Nile created predictable agricultural cycles, allowing for long-term settlement, population continuity, and the accumulation of cultural memory. These environmental conditions supported one of the earliest sustained civilizations in human history, extending from the late 4th millennium BCE into the Roman period. Egyptian mythology developed not as a single unified system, but as a layered body of religious concepts, local traditions, and state-sponsored theological frameworks that evolved over more than 3,000 years. Archaeological evidence from early ritual sites, funerary complexes, temple inscriptions, and mortuary texts indicates that mythological ideas were embedded within everyday social organization, kingship ideology, and funerary practice. Rather than existing as abstract narratives, Egyptian myths functioned as explanatory systems that structured relationships between humans, the natural world, and the divine. Deities were closely associated with specific landscapes, cities, and political centers, reflecting both environmental realities and administrative consolidation. The historical significance of Egyptian mythology lies in its longevity, internal coherence, and influence on later Mediterranean religious thought. Its development would later shape concepts of divine kingship, cosmology, and the afterlife across neighboring cultures. The geographic foundations of Egyptian mythology were established within the environmental conditions of northeastern Africa, where human settlement developed in sustained proximity to the Nile River. This river system, extending over 6,000 kilometers from equatorial Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, created a linear zone of fertility within an otherwise arid landscape. The Nile Valley formed a narrow ecological corridor in which water, soil, and vegetation were concentrated, shaping patterns of habitation from the late prehistoric period onward. Archaeological evidence indicates that permanent settlements increased in density along this corridor as early as the 6th millennium BCE, reflecting a gradual shift from mobile subsistence strategies towards sedentary agricultural life. The defining environmental feature of the Nile Valley was the river's annual inundation. Unlike many river systems subject to irregular flooding, the Nile exhibited a relatively predictable cycle. Each year, summer rains in the Ethiopian highlands caused the river to rise, overflow its banks, and deposit layers of nutrient-rich silt across adjacent floodplains. When the waters receded, the soil retained moisture and fertility, allowing agricultural production to resume with minimal technological intervention. This cycle of flooding and renewal created conditions for long-term food security and population stability. The consistency of this environmental rhythm had significant cultural consequences. Agricultural planning, settlement permanence, and seasonal labor organization became synchronized with the river's behavior. Over time, these repeated patterns reinforced a perception of the natural world as structured and intelligible. Environmental regularity fostered an understanding of existence as governed by recurring processes rather than random disruption. Such perceptions formed an early conceptual foundation for later mythological interpretations of order, continuity, and maintenance. The spatial limitations imposed by geography further contributed to cultural cohesion. The Nile Valley was bordered on both sides by deserts that limited arable land and constrained large-scale movement. The Western Desert and the Eastern Desert presented harsh conditions unsuitable for sustained settlement, effectively channeling population growth along the riverbanks. This concentration reduced fragmentation and encouraged shared cultural practices across communities distributed along the river's length. Communication and exchange were facilitated by the Nile itself, which functioned as a natural transportation route connecting Upper and Lower Egypt. Orientation within this environment was shaped by the river's direction and the sun's movement. The Nile flowed from south to north, while prevailing winds traveled from north to south, enabling efficient river navigation in both directions. These consistent directional patterns provided a stable spatial framework that influenced how space was conceptualized. Cardinal directions acquired functional and symbolic relevance grounded in daily experience rather than abstraction. Over time, such orientation would be incorporated into architectural planning and ritual alignment. The daily solar cycle also played a role in shaping environmental awareness. Sunrise in the east marked the beginning of activity, while sunset in the west corresponded with rest and cessation. These observations were constant features of life along the Nile. Although early communities did not articulate formal cosmologies, repeated interaction with these patterns established associations between direction, time, and function. These associations would later be expressed through religious symbolism embedded in mythological systems. Environmental observation did not immediately produce structured myths. Instead, it generated a framework of experiential knowledge through which meaning could be assigned to natural processes. Flooding, soil renewal, plant growth, and seasonal repetition were integrated into daily life as expected occurrences. The absence of dramatic environmental volatility reduced the need for explanatory narratives centered on catastrophe. Instead, religious interpretation developed around preservation, regulation, and continuity. The Nile Valley's geography thus supported the gradual accumulation of cultural memory. Generations lived within the same environmental constraints, observing the same cycles and responding with similar practices. This continuity allowed religious ideas to persist, evolve, and layer over time. Mythology emerged not as a sudden intellectual construction, but as an interpretive response to sustained environmental interaction. The geographic and environmental conditions of the Nile Valley, therefore, established the foundational context within which Egyptian mythology would later take form. Within the environmental structure established by the Nile Valley, the river itself assumed a central interpretive role in early Egyptian religious thought. Its presence was continuous and unavoidable, shaping patterns of labor, settlement, and seasonal expectation. The Nile was not perceived merely as a source of water, but as a regulating force that sustained the conditions necessary for social continuity. The predictable alternation between inundation and recession provided a visible demonstration of transformation without permanent loss. Land submerged beneath floodwaters reliably re-emerged, renewed rather than destroyed. This observation reinforced an understanding of change as cyclical and restorative. The floodplain created by the Nile was distinct from the surrounding landscape. During inundation, boundaries between fields disappeared, and the visible markers of human organization were temporarily erased. When the waters withdrew, those boundaries were re-established through cultivation and irrigation. This repeated dissolution and restoration of order contributed to an environmental model in which disruption was temporary and inherently linked to renewal. Such patterns informed later mythological distinctions between regulated space and unregulated space, without framing them as mutually exclusive. Beyond the floodplain lay the deserts, whose environmental conditions differed sharply from those of the cultivated land. These regions were characterized by aridity, extreme temperature variation, and limited biological productivity. While not entirely inaccessible, the deserts required deliberate preparation to traverse and offered little support for permanent habitation. As a result, they occupied a marginal position in daily life. Mining expeditions, trade routes, and occasional nomadic movement occurred within these zones, but they remained outside the core sphere of agricultural society. The contrast between river valley and desert informed symbolic categorization rooted in lived experience. The cultivated land was associated with sustenance, predictability, and communal labor. The desert, by contrast, represented exposure, isolation, and uncertainty. These associations emerged gradually through practical interaction rather than formal doctrine. Environmental boundaries became conceptual boundaries, structuring how space was evaluated and understood. This spatial differentiation would later be expressed through religious language describing order and its absence. Despite these contrasts, the relationship between valley and desert was not interpreted as absolute opposition. The desert provided essential resources, including stone, metals, and minerals used in construction and ritual production. Access to these materials required engagement with environments perceived as hazardous yet necessary. This dynamic reinforced an understanding of balance in which stability depended upon interaction with less hospitable spaces. Environmental risk was integrated into economic and social systems rather than excluded. Climatic conditions during the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods further reinforced environmental continuity. Paleoclimatic data indicates relatively stable rainfall patterns in regions feeding the Nile's sources, maintaining the regularity of inundation. This stability supported population growth and the expansion of agricultural infrastructure. Surplus production enabled specialization of labor, including the development of administrative and ritual roles. As societies grew more complex, religious practices became increasingly formalized. Permanent architectural construction reflected these developments. Early ritual structures and burial sites were built with durable materials, indicating an expectation of long-term use. The decision to invest labor in permanent monuments was predicated on confidence in environmental stability. These structures anchored religious practice within specific locations, transforming natural features into fixed points of ritual significance. Riverbanks, elevated ground, and transitional zones between cultivated land and desert were repeatedly selected for religious use. The orientation of these structures demonstrates the integration of environmental observation into religious practice. Alignments with cardinal directions and solar movement indicate an effort to situate human activity within a broader natural order. Such alignments were not symbolic abstractions imposed upon the landscape, but reflections of consistent environmental reference points. The landscape provided a framework through which meaning could be expressed and reinforced through repetition. Over time, these practices contributed to the emergence of sacred geography. Certain locations accumulated religious significance through sustained use, ritual repetition, and architectural investment. Environmental features became inseparable from religious interpretation, serving as stable anchors for evolving belief systems. The geography of the Nile Valley thus continued to shape mythological thought not through narrative imposition, but through persistent material and spatial engagement. The gradual formation of sacred geography represented a further stage in the relationship between environment and religious interpretation in early Egypt. As religious practices became increasingly institutionalized, specific locations acquired enduring significance through repeated ritual use. This process was not driven by abstract theology, but by practical engagement with the landscape over extended periods. Natural features that were already prominent in daily experience became focal points for religious activity, reinforcing their symbolic importance through continuity rather than innovation. Riverbanks served as primary zones for settlement and ritual because they represented the interface between water and land. This transitional space embodied both stability and change, making it suitable for activities concerned with maintenance and renewal. Over time, temples and administrative centers were constructed in proximity to the Nile, anchoring religious authority within the most productive environment available. These structures were oriented with careful attention to cardinal directions, reflecting an effort to harmonize built space with observable natural order. The western edge of the cultivated land gradually became associated with mortuary activity. This development was influenced by the daily solar cycle, in which the sun visibly declined in the west before disappearing below the horizon. The West was not conceptualized as an abstract realm, but as a direction consistently associated with the end of visible activity. Burial grounds were established on the desert margins west of the Nile, where stable ground provided suitable conditions for long-term tomb construction. This spatial pattern reinforced associations between landscape, direction, and ritual function. Elevated desert plateaus and cliffs also assumed religious importance. These features offered permanence and visibility, qualities valued in funerary architecture and monumental construction. Their separation from cultivated land marked them as transitional spaces between habitation and isolation. Over generations, repeated use of these locations for burial and commemoration embedded them within religious tradition. The physical endurance of these sites further reinforced their symbolic role as enduring points within an otherwise cyclical environment. Mountains and horizon lines contributed additional layers of meaning. The horizon, where the sun appeared and disappeared, became a consistent visual marker of transition. This observation did not initially produce narrative explanation, but established a perceptual framework through which concepts of emergence and withdrawal could be understood. Religious interpretation later incorporated these observations into structured mythological systems, but their origins lay in direct environmental experience. Regional variation persisted within this framework. Communities along different sections of the Nile interacted with distinct local landscapes, influencing the emphasis of their religious practices. Northern regions closer to the delta experienced broader floodplains and increased interaction with maritime environments, while southern regions encountered narrower valleys and greater proximity to desert expanses. These differences shaped local cult traditions without disrupting overall cultural cohesion. Shared dependence on the Nile maintained a common environmental foundation across regions. As political authority expanded, these geographically grounded beliefs were increasingly integrated into centralized ideology. Rulers drew upon established environmental symbolism to articulate legitimacy and continuity. Monumental architecture, aligned with natural features, communicated stability and order through familiarity rather than novelty. By situating political power within an already meaningful landscape, authority was presented as an extension of existing environmental relationships rather than an imposition upon them. Administrative unification along the Nile facilitated the circulation of religious practices and spatial conventions. Sacred sites gained wider recognition as pilgrimage and state-sponsored ritual increased. Nevertheless, the underlying environmental logic remained consistent. Religious interpretation continued to derive meaning from observable processes rather than abstract speculation. This grounding allowed mythological systems to remain adaptable while retaining internal coherence. The geographic and environmental origins of Egyptian mythology therefore functioned as a structural foundation rather than a completed system. By embedding religious interpretation within stable natural patterns, early Egyptian society established a framework capable of long-term continuity. Environmental observation informed spatial organization, ritual practice, and symbolic association without requiring uniform narrative formulation. This framework supported subsequent developments in language, social organization, and political theology, while remaining anchored in the physical realities of the Nile Valley. The development of Egyptian mythology occurred alongside the formation of a distinct linguistic and ethnographic identity within the Nile Valley. The Egyptian language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, a broad grouping that also includes Semitic, Berber, Cushitic, and Chadic languages. Linguistic evidence suggests that early forms of Egyptian emerged through prolonged settlement and internal development rather than abrupt population replacement. This continuity allowed religious terminology and symbolic expressions to accumulate gradually, preserving conceptual stability across long chronological spans. The earliest written form of Egyptian appears at the end of the 4th millennium BCE, coinciding with political consolidation and administrative expansion. Hieroglyphic writing emerged as a complex system combining phonetic signs, logograms, and determinatives. This structure allowed words to convey sound, meaning, and visual association simultaneously. Religious concepts benefited directly from this system, as divine names and ritual terms were often written with determinatives that visually reinforced their semantic category. Language thus functioned not only as communication, but as an extension of religious symbolism. Ethnographically, the population of ancient Egypt was shaped by long-term habitation within a geographically constrained environment. Archaeological continuity in settlement patterns, burial customs, and material culture indicates gradual cultural evolution rather than frequent large-scale migration. While interaction with neighboring regions occurred through trade and diplomacy, the core population maintained a stable cultural identity rooted in the Nile Valley. This stability supported the preservation of local religious traditions alongside broader cultural integration. Regional diversity, nevertheless, existed within this framework. Communities along the Nile were organized into administrative districts, later known as nomes. Each nome maintained local traditions, including specific deities and ritual practices. These local identities reflected variations in landscape, economic activity, and historical development. Rather than fragmenting religious culture, this diversity contributed to a pluralistic system in which multiple mythological traditions coexisted. Language facilitated the integration of these traditions. The flexibility of the Egyptian writing system allowed religious concepts to be adapted without erasing earlier meanings. Divine names could be combined, modified, or contextualized through epithets and titles, preserving local associations while allowing broader recognition. This linguistic adaptability supported theological synthesis over time, particularly as political authority expanded. The ethnographic continuity of the population also influenced religious transmission. Knowledge of rituals, myths, and sacred language was passed through priestly institutions and familial instruction. Oral tradition remained significant even after the development of writing, reinforcing continuity through repeated performance. Written texts formalized religious language, but did not replace lived practice. This dual transmission system allowed mythology to remain embedded in social life, rather than confined to elite literacy. The use of language in religious contexts was closely associated with authority. Literacy was concentrated among scribes and priests, whose training included mastery of religious vocabulary and formulaic expression. The act of writing was itself imbued with religious significance, understood as a means of stabilizing and preserving order. Sacred texts were not narrative compositions in the modern sense, but functional instruments intended to activate divine processes through correct expression. Ethnographic interaction with neighboring populations introduced additional complexity. Contact with Nubian, Levantine, and later Mediterranean cultures resulted in limited linguistic borrowing and symbolic exchange. Foreign deities were sometimes incorporated through processes of equivalence, in which their functions were aligned with existing Egyptian gods. Language enabled this process by framing foreign concepts within familiar semantic structures. Despite external contact, the core linguistic and ethnographic framework remained intact. Egyptian mythology continued to be articulated through a language deeply connected to its environment and social organization. The combination of linguistic continuity and ethnographic stability allowed mythological concepts to endure, adapt, and expand without losing coherence. This foundation would shape the formalization of religious texts and the material expression of belief in subsequent periods. The internal structure of the Egyptian language played a decisive role in shaping how religious concepts were categorized and transmitted. Egyptian vocabulary was highly context-dependent, with many words carrying multiple meanings determined by usage and symbolic association. This flexibility allowed religious language to evolve without requiring the abandonment of earlier terminology. Words associated with divine action, cosmic order, or ritual performance could be adapted across periods while retaining their core conceptual function. As a result, mythological continuity was maintained even as theological emphasis shifted. Hieroglyphic writing reinforced this continuity through its visual dimension. Determinatives appended to words provided semantic clarification without altering pronunciation. In religious contexts, determinatives depicting deities, sacred objects, or abstract concepts guided interpretation and reinforced meaning. This system allowed the same phonetic expression to convey different theological nuances depending on context. Such precision was essential for ritual language, where accuracy was believed to sustain effectiveness. Linguistic form was therefore inseparable from religious function. The coexistence of multiple written registers further shaped mythological expression. While hieroglyphs were used primarily in monumental and sacred contexts, hieratic and later demotic scripts served administrative and practical purposes. Religious texts appeared across these registers, reflecting different audiences and functions. Formal temple inscriptions emphasized permanence and cosmic order, while coffin texts and instructional writings reflected more individualized religious concerns. This multiplicity allowed mythology to permeate various social levels without becoming fragmented. Ethnographic stability supported this linguistic complexity. The long-term continuity of population within the Nile Valley ensured that spoken language evolved gradually. Changes in pronunciation and grammar occurred over centuries, but religious vocabulary remained conservative. Sacred terms preserved archaic forms long after they had disappeared from everyday speech. This conservatism reinforced the perception of religious language as timeless and authoritative, distinct from ordinary communication. Local identity remained an important factor in religious expression. Each region maintained distinctive cult practices tied to specific deities and landscapes. These local traditions were articulated through regional linguistic preferences, including variant spellings and titles. Rather than creating division, such variation contributed to a layered religious system in which local and national identities coexisted. Language provided a mechanism for integrating these layers by allowing multiple expressions of the same divine function. The priesthood played a central role in maintaining linguistic and ethnographic continuity. Priestly education emphasized mastery of sacred language, ritual formulae, and theological classification. Training occurred within temple institutions that functioned as centers of learning and cultural preservation. Through repeated ritual performance and textual copying, priests reinforced standardized language while transmitting local tradition. This institutional continuity supported the long-term stability of mythological frameworks. Ethnographic interaction within Egypt itself also influenced religious development. Population movement along the Nile for administrative, economic, and ritual purposes facilitated cultural exchange between regions. Pilgrimage to major cult centers exposed individuals to diverse religious expressions, which were then integrated into local practice. Language mediated this exchange by providing shared terminology that allowed concepts to be communicated across regional boundaries. Foreign influence, while limited, required additional linguistic adaptation. When external populations entered Egypt through trade or political control, their religious concepts were interpreted through Egyptian linguistic categories. Rather than adopting foreign terminology wholesale, Egyptian scribes translated divine functions into familiar language. This process preserved the internal logic of Egyptian mythology while accommodating external presence. Linguistic equivalence allowed for incorporation without loss of identity. Over time, these linguistic and ethnographic processes produced a religious system characterized by continuity through adaptation. Mythological concepts were not fixed narratives, but classifications of divine function expressed through language shaped by environment and social structure. The durability of Egyptian mythology was therefore inseparable from the properties of the language used to articulate it. Linguistic flexibility, combined with ethnographic stability, ensured that religious meaning could be preserved, reinterpreted, and transmitted across generations without disruption. The long-term interaction between language, ethnicity, and religious identity in ancient Egypt resulted in a system where mythology functioned as a classificatory framework rather than a fixed narrative tradition. Egyptian religious concepts were embedded within linguistic structures that emphasized categorization, function, and relational meaning. Deities were defined less by personal mythology and more by domains of influence, titles, and contextual roles. Language allowed these roles to be expressed with precision, ensuring consistency across ritual, administration, and daily practice. Ethnographic continuity reinforced this linguistic structure. The relative demographic stability of the Nile Valley limited the disruption of cultural transmission. Unlike regions characterized by frequent population turnover, Egypt experienced gradual internal change shaped by environmental constraints. This continuity enabled religious language to remain intelligible across centuries. Even as spoken Egyptian evolved, the conceptual framework underlying religious terminology remained stable. Mythological ideas were therefore transmitted not through narrative innovation, but through sustained repetition and institutional reinforcement. Kinship structures and community organization also played a role in ethnographic transmission. Religious knowledge was disseminated within households, local cult centers, and professional priestly lineages. Children encountered religious language through naming practices, domestic rituals, and participation in communal festivals. Divine names and epithets were embedded in personal names, reinforcing familiarity with religious concepts from an early age. This everyday exposure ensured that mythology remained integrated into social identity rather than confined to elite discourse. The classification of deities reflected both linguistic and ethnographic organization. Gods were often associated with specific localities, reflecting the settlement patterns of the population. A deity's name frequently incorporated geographic identifiers, linking divine function to place. As political unification progressed, these local deities were incorporated into broader theological systems through linguistic expansion rather than suppression. Titles and epithets allowed gods to acquire additional roles without losing local significance. Language thus facilitated theological integration while preserving regional identity. Ethnographic distinctions were also evident in ritual specialization. Certain regions developed reputations for specific religious functions, such as funerary practice, solar worship, or oracular consultation. These specializations were communicated through standardized religious language that allowed recognition across Egypt. Ritual texts circulated between temples, reinforcing shared terminology while allowing localized emphasis. This circulation contributed to a coherent mythological system, grounded in shared linguistic conventions. Periods of political transition further demonstrate the resilience of this structure. During times of fragmentation, such as the First Intermediate Period, centralized authority weakened, but local religious language remained intact. Mythological classification persisted through temple practice and funerary texts, maintaining continuity despite administrative disruption. The persistence of religious language during political instability underscores its grounding in ethnographic practice rather than state enforcement alone. Foreign rule introduced additional challenges to linguistic and ethnographic coherence. During periods of Libyan, Nubian, Persian, and later Greek influence, Egyptian language and religious terminology continued to be used in temple contexts. Even when administrative languages changed, sacred language remained conservative. This separation between administrative and religious language allowed mythology to retain its structure while accommodating external governance. Translation and bilingual inscription further illustrate how linguistic systems were used to preserve religious meaning. Endurance of Egyptian mythology into the late period and beyond reflects the effectiveness of this linguistic ethnographic framework. As spoken Egyptian gradually gave way to Coptic and later Arabic, religious concepts persisted through textual preservation and reinterpretation. Mythological classification survived in altered linguistic forms, demonstrating adaptability without conceptual collapse. The language shaped how religious meaning was stored, transmitted, and reactivated across time. Ultimately, Egyptian mythology cannot be separated from the language and people who sustained it. Linguistic structure provided the tools for defining divine function, while ethnographic continuity ensured consistent transmission. Together, they produced a religious system capable of remarkable longevity. This foundation would support the material expression of belief visible in archaeology and ritual practice, forming the basis for subsequent developments in Egyptian religious culture. The reconstruction of Egyptian mythology relies heavily on archaeological evidence, as religious concepts were embedded within material culture rather than preserved as independent narrative texts. From the late pre-dynastic period onward, symbolic expression appeared consistently in funerary contexts, settlement remains, and ritual objects. These materials provide insight into how early religious ideas were practiced, transmitted, and gradually formalized. Archaeology reveals mythology not as a literary tradition, but as a system enacted through objects, spaces, and repeated actions. Pre-dynastic cemeteries offer some of the earliest indications of symbolic thought. Grave goods such as pottery, pallets, and figurines display recurring motifs, including animals associated with strength, fertility, or protection. These symbols were not decorative in a modern sense, but reflected beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead. The inclusion of goods within burials suggests an early conception of continuity beyond death, grounded in material provision rather than articulated doctrine. Such practices established a foundation for later mythological systems concerned with regeneration and persistence. Animal imagery played a particularly important role in early material culture. Representations of cattle, birds, and wild animals appear frequently on ceramics and ritual objects. These images correspond to the ecological environment of the Nile Valley, where human survival depended on close interaction with animal life. Over time, these representations became increasingly stylized and standardized, forming the visual basis for later divine iconography. Archaeological continuity demonstrates that many later deities emerged from earlier symbolic associations embedded in material practice. Ritual objects such as ceremonial pallets and mace heads further illustrate the integration of symbolism and authority. These objects often combined functional elements with symbolic imagery, linking political power to religious meaning. Their deposition in ritual contexts indicates that they served roles beyond practical use. The presence of mythologically significant symbols on such objects reflects an early synthesis of ritual, authority, and material expression. As settlement patterns became more complex, architectural remains began to reflect religious organization. Early shrines and communal structures show deliberate placement and construction techniques distinct from domestic buildings. These structures served as focal points for collective ritual activity, reinforcing shared religious concepts through spatial experience. The durability of these constructions indicates an expectation of long-term use, reflecting confidence in environmental and social stability. Funerary architecture provides particularly rich evidence for mythological development. The evolution from simple pit burials to mastabas and later monumental tombs illustrates increasing investment in the afterlife. Tomb design incorporated symbolic elements such as orientation, chamber layout, and decorative motifs. These features reflect beliefs about movement, transformation, and protection after death. Archaeological consistency across regions indicates shared religious assumptions even as local variations persisted. The emergence of inscribed texts within funerary contexts marks a significant development. Early inscriptions were not narrative accounts, but functional expressions intended to ensure protection and continuity. These texts demonstrate how language and material culture intersected to produce effective religious practice. The placement of inscriptions within tombs indicates that written words were understood as active components of ritual rather than passive records. Material evidence also reveals the gradual standardization of religious symbolism. Repetition of iconographic forms across sites suggests the existence of shared frameworks for interpreting divine function. Statues, reliefs, and ritual implements adhered to recognizable conventions, allowing participants to identify and engage with religious meaning consistently. This standardization reflects institutional support through temples and workshops dedicated to ritual production. Archaeological culture thus provides a cumulative record of mythological development. Objects and structures embody religious concepts without requiring explicit explanation. Through repeated use, these materials reinforced shared understanding across generations. Mythology emerged through practice embedded in material form, grounded in the physical realities of daily life. This material foundation would later support more elaborate theological articulation while remaining central to religious experience. As Egyptian society entered the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods, archaeological evidence demonstrates an increasing formalization of religious expression through material culture. This process was closely linked to the consolidation of political authority and the expansion of institutional religious centers. Temples, workshops, and funerary complexes became primary sites where mythological concepts were materialized, standardized, and transmitted. The archaeological record from this period reflects a shift from localized symbolic practice toward coordinated religious production supported by centralized administration. Temple architecture provides insight into this transformation. Early temples were constructed using durable materials and followed consistent spatial layouts that distinguished sacred space from surrounding settlements. These structures were oriented according to cardinal directions and often aligned with solar movement, reflecting continued reliance on environmental reference points. Within these spaces, ritual activity was regulated through architectural segmentation, controlling access and movement. Such design reinforced hierarchical religious organization and structured engagement with divine representations. Statuary and reliefs formed a central component of temple material culture. Deities were depicted according to established iconographic conventions that conveyed specific attributes and functions. The consistency of these representations across regions suggests centralized oversight in artistic production. Workshops attached to temples produced standardized images that could be distributed or replicated, ensuring uniformity in religious representation. This standardization allowed mythology to be visually communicated without reliance on narrative explanation. Material evidence from offering practices further illustrates the functional role of objects in religious life. Votive offerings, food remains, and ritual vessels found in temple contexts indicate repeated cycles of ritual activity. These practices reinforced mythological concepts through action rather than storytelling. Objects served as mediators between humans and deities, embodying relational functions defined by ritual use. Archaeological remains demonstrate that such practices were sustained over long periods, contributing to the durability of religious systems. Funerary material culture continued to evolve alongside temple practice. The proliferation of decorated tombs during the Old Kingdom reflects increasing emphasis on the afterlife within religious thought. Wall reliefs depicted agricultural labor, craft production, and ritual scenes, presenting an idealized continuation of earthly existence. These images were not illustrative narratives, but functional components intended to activate desired outcomes. Archaeological repetition of these motifs across tombs indicates shared assumptions regarding posthumous continuity. The introduction of pyramid texts marks a significant development in the relationship between material culture and mythology. These inscriptions were carved directly into the walls of royal burial chambers, integrating language with architectural space. The texts consisted of utterances intended to guide transformation and protection rather than recount mythic events. Their physical placement demonstrates that written language was understood as materially effective. Archaeology, thus, reveals mythology operating through inscription as a ritual technology. Craft specialization played a crucial role in sustaining this system. Artisans trained in stone carving, painting, and metallurgy produced objects according to religious specifications. Tools, materials, and workshop remains indicate organized production aligned with temple and state needs. This specialization ensured continuity in form and function, allowing religious symbolism to remain consistent across generations. Material repetition reinforced conceptual stability without requiring textual elaboration. Regional workshops adapted standardized forms to local contexts, introducing minor variations while preserving overall coherence. Archaeological comparison of artifacts from different sites demonstrates this balance between uniformity and regional expression. Such variation reflects localized religious emphasis within a shared mythological framework. Material culture thus accommodated diversity without fragmenting religious identity. Archaeological stratigraphy reveals the temporal depth of these practices. Successive building phases, object reuse, and ritual deposition illustrate continuity rather than abrupt change. Mythological systems were maintained through cumulative material investment rather than episodic innovation. The persistence of architectural layouts and iconographic forms across centuries underscores the role of material culture in stabilizing religious interpretation. Through temples, tombs, and ritual objects, mythology was enacted repeatedly in physical space. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that belief was sustained through material engagement rather than narrative transmission. Objects and structures functioned as carriers of religious meaning, shaping experience through presence and use. This material foundation enabled mythology to endure, adapt, and expand while remaining anchored in tangible practice. The continued expansion of archaeological material during the Middle and New Kingdom periods further illustrates how Egyptian mythology was sustained through physical form rather than narrative codification. As temple complexes grew in scale and complexity, they became repositories of accumulated religious meaning. Successive generations added structures, reliefs, and inscriptions to existing sacred sites, reinforcing continuity through architectural layering. Archaeological stratification at major centers reveals deliberate preservation of earlier elements alongside new construction, indicating respect for inherited religious frameworks. Temple relief programs from these periods demonstrate increased complexity in iconography while maintaining established conventions. Scenes depicting ritual processions, offerings, and divine interaction followed standardized visual grammar. Figures were arranged according to hierarchical scale and spatial order, reinforcing theological principles through composition. These reliefs did not recount stories sequentially, but presented timeless ritual moments. Their repetition across walls and courtyards emphasized permanence rather than progression, embedding mythological concepts within an unchanging visual environment. Portable ritual objects further extended the reach of religious material culture. Amulets, figurines, and inscribed tools found in domestic and funerary contexts indicate the diffusion of mythological symbolism beyond institutional spaces. These items allowed individuals to participate in religious practice within daily life. Archaeological distribution patterns show that such objects were widely accessible, suggesting that mythological engagement was not restricted to elite contexts. Material culture thus functioned as a medium through which religious concepts permeated all social levels. Burial assemblages from non-elite contexts provide additional insight into the material expression of belief. Coffins, shrouds, and modest grave goods reflect standardized religious assumptions adapted to varying economic means. Decorative motifs and inscriptions followed recognized conventions, demonstrating that mythological classification remained consistent even when material investment differed. Archaeological evidence indicates that access to religious symbolism expanded over time, reflecting shifts in social participation rather than theological transformation. Textual material embedded in objects continued to function as ritual instruments. Coffin texts and later funerary inscriptions were integrated into the surfaces of coffins, walls, and papyri placed within burial chambers. Their physical presence was essential to their purpose. Archaeological context confirms that these texts were positioned deliberately, reinforcing their role as active components of ritual space. Mythology operated through these inscriptions as a practical system guiding transformation rather than as a narrative record. Workshop remains reveal how material continuity was maintained. Evidence of standardized tools, templates, and production techniques indicates controlled replication of religious forms. Training systems transmitted craft knowledge alongside symbolic conventions, ensuring consistency across generations. Archaeological evidence of long-lived workshops attached to temples demonstrates institutional investment in preserving material expression. Mythological stability was thus supported through sustained production rather than textual preservation alone. Foreign influence during later periods introduced new materials and artistic styles, yet core religious forms persisted. Archaeological evidence from periods of external rule shows adaptation within established frameworks. Imported materials were incorporated into traditional forms rather than replacing them. This selective integration underscores the resilience of material-based mythology. The physical vocabulary of religious expression remained intelligible even as political circumstances changed. Decline in temple construction during late antiquity is also visible archaeologically. Reduced maintenance, reuse of building materials, and gradual abandonment mark the waning of institutional support. However, the persistence of religious objects in domestic contexts indicates continued private engagement. Archaeology thus reveals a gradual transformation rather than abrupt cessation. Material traces demonstrate how mythology receded from public architecture while remaining embedded in lived practice. The archaeological record, therefore, presents Egyptian mythology as a system sustained through material continuity. Objects, spaces, and inscriptions carried religious meaning across time without requiring narrative coherence. Through repeated interaction with these materials, belief was reinforced as a practical orientation toward the world. Archaeology provides access to this process by preserving the physical residues of ritual life. The material culture of ancient Egypt stands as evidence of mythology, enacted through form, repetition, and presence, rather than through story. The development of early Egyptian social and political organization occurred in close association with emerging religious frameworks that articulated authority, hierarchy, and communal order. During the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, increasing social stratification is evident in settlement patterns, burial differentiation, and administrative control. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that leadership roles became formalized as communities expanded in size and complexity. Within this context, mythology provided a conceptual structure through which authority could be legitimized and stabilized. The emergence of kingship represents a critical development in this process. Early rulers were distinguished not only by political power, but by their symbolic function within a religious worldview. The king was understood as occupying a unique position that linked human society to divine forces. This role was not articulated through abstract political theory, but through ritual practice and symbolic representation. Royal authority was expressed through material culture, titulary, and ceremonial activity that embedded the ruler within a cosmological framework. Royal iconography from the early dynastic period demonstrates the integration of political leadership with religious symbolism. Objects such as ceremonial palettes and inscriptions depict rulers performing ritual acts associated with divine sanction. These representations did not narrate myths, but visually communicated the ruler's role as an agent of order. The repetition of such imagery across contexts reinforced a shared understanding of kingship as a stabilizing institution grounded in religious meaning. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt further illustrates the use of mythological concepts to frame political consolidation. Administrative integration was accompanied by symbolic language emphasizing balance, duality, and completeness. These concepts were expressed through royal titles, regalia, and ceremonial architecture. The ruler embodied unity not merely as a territorial administrator, but as a figure maintaining equilibrium within a broader cosmic system. Mythology thus provided a framework through which political change could be interpreted as continuity rather than disruption. Royal titulary offers insight into this process. Titles incorporated references to divine associations and cosmic principles, reinforcing the perception of the king as an intermediary figure. These titles were not personal descriptors, but functional classifications that articulated the ruler's role within an ordered system. Their consistent use across reigns indicates institutional continuity rather than individual innovation. Language and ritual together sustain the authority of kingship as an enduring structure. Administrative centers developed alongside this symbolic system. Early capitals functioned as hubs of political control, economic management, and religious activity. Temples within these centers were integral to governance, serving as sites where ritual, redistribution, and record-keeping converged. The close association between administration and religion ensured that political authority was continuously reinforced through ritual practice. Mythological concepts were enacted through daily institutional routines rather than articulated through doctrine. The emergence of specialized priesthoods reflects increasing organizational complexity. Priests were responsible for maintaining ritual schedules, preserving sacred language, and overseeing temple resources. Their roles required training and institutional support, indicating the formalization of religious labor. Priesthoods functioned within administrative hierarchies, linking religious authority to political structures. This integration allowed mythology to be regulated and transmitted consistently across generations. Local elites also participated in this system, adopting mythological symbolism to express status and legitimacy. Elite burials incorporated iconography and architectural features associated with royal and divine authority. These practices indicate the diffusion of religious concepts beyond the royal court. Mythology thus functioned as a shared ideological framework that structured social relationships across multiple levels of society. Early Egyptian social organization therefore developed through the interaction of political authority, religious symbolism, and institutional practice. Mythology provided a means of articulating hierarchy and cohesion without reliance on explicit theoretical explanation. Through ritual, language, and material expression, social order was presented as an extension of cosmic order. This framework established patterns that would continue to shape Egyptian governance and religious life in subsequent periods. As early Egyptian political structures matured, the relationship between social hierarchy and religious authority became increasingly institutionalized. The consolidation of kingship required systems capable of administering resources, labor, and ritual obligations across expanding territories. Mythology functioned within this process as a stabilizing framework that linked administrative order to cosmic principles. Rather than existing separately from governance, religious concepts were embedded directly into the mechanisms of political control. The organization of the state relied on a hierarchy of officials whose authority derived from the king. These officials operated within a system that framed service to the state as participation in maintaining order. Administrative titles and duties were closely associated with religious responsibilities, reinforcing the perception that governance itself was a sacred activity. Mythological language describing balance and continuity provided justification for obedience and social differentiation without explicit coercion. Temples played a central role in this integration. Beyond their ritual functions, temples acted as economic institutions managing land, labor, and surplus goods. Records indicate that temples controlled agricultural estates and coordinated large-scale redistribution. This economic role reinforced their political significance. Religious ritual, agricultural productivity, and administrative oversight were interconnected within temple complexes, creating a unified institutional structure. Mythology underpinned this arrangement by presenting material abundance as a reflection of maintained order. Priestly hierarchies developed alongside administrative ones. Priests were organized according to rank, specialization, and function, mirroring the stratified structure of the state. High priests oversaw major cult centers, while lower-ranking priests conducted daily rituals. This division of labor ensured regular performance of religious duties, reinforcing continuity through repetition. Mythological concepts were sustained through these practices rather than through centralized theological instruction. The codification of ritual schedules further demonstrates institutional integration. Calendars regulating festivals, offerings, and ceremonies were standardized and synchronized with agricultural cycles. These schedules linked state administration to environmental rhythms already embedded within religious interpretation. The coordination of labor for ritual events reinforced collective participation in maintaining order. Mythology thus operated through time regulation as well as spatial organization. Local governance reflected similar patterns. Regional officials administered nomes while overseeing local cults. These officials functioned as intermediaries between central authority and regional communities. By supervising religious activity alongside administrative duties, they reinforced the alignment of political loyalty and religious participation. Local temples maintained distinct traditions while adhering to broader institutional norms, demonstrating how diversity was accommodated within a unified framework. Funerary practices among non-royal elites provide additional evidence of mythology's role in social organization. Tomb inscriptions and iconography emphasize continuity of service and moral alignment with order. Elite individuals presented themselves as participants in maintaining stability, both during life and after death. Such representations indicate that mythological concepts shaped social aspiration and self-identification beyond the royal sphere. Legal and ethical concepts were also framed through religious language. Principles governing conduct emphasized proper behavior within an ordered system rather than abstract morality. Compliance with social norms was presented as participation in maintaining balance. Mythology thus informed expectations of behavior across social strata, reinforcing hierarchy as a functional necessity rather than an imposed structure. This integration of mythology and administration allowed early Egyptian society to manage increasing complexity without fragmenting cultural identity. Authority was distributed through institutions that combined ritual and governance. Mythological concepts provided a shared interpretive framework that legitimized hierarchy and coordinated collective effort. Through sustained institutional practice, social order was presented as natural, continuous, and necessary. By embedding religious interpretation within administrative systems, early Egyptian society established durable patterns of governance. Mythology functioned not as narrative explanation, but as an organizing principle enacted through institutions. This alignment of political authority and religious practice would continue to shape Egyptian social organization as territorial control expanded and external influences increased. The participation of broader society in mythologically grounded political order further illustrates how early Egyptian organization relied on shared religious assumptions rather than centralized enforcement alone. Social cohesion was maintained through widespread engagement with ritual practices that reinforced hierarchy as an expression of order. From agricultural laborers to local officials, individuals encountered mythological concepts through festivals, offerings, and communal observance tied to state institutions. These practices embedded political authority within everyday experience. Local elites served as critical intermediaries in this structure. Their authority derived from proximity to both administrative power and religious institutions. Elite residences and tombs often occupied prominent positions within settlements, reflecting their role as representatives of order at the local level. Through sponsorship of rituals, maintenance of local temples, and participation in state projects, these elites reinforced the connection between governance and religious obligation. Mythological symbolism within elite funerary contexts demonstrates their alignment with state ideology. Regional cults provided a mechanism for integrating local identity into national structure. While each region maintained distinctive religious traditions, these were incorporated into broader theological systems through state recognition and ritual coordination. Local deities were acknowledged within national pantheons, allowing regional communities to participate in centralized authority without abandoning local practice. This integration reduced resistance by presenting political unification as inclusion rather than replacement. Mythology thus functioned as a flexible framework accommodating diversity within hierarchy. The relationship between military organization and mythology also reflects early social integration. Military success was interpreted as evidence of maintained order, while defense of territory was framed as preservation of stability. Soldiers participated in rituals before and after campaigns, reinforcing the idea that military activity was an extension of religious duty. These practices linked physical force to mythological justification, embedding warfare within a broader social and cosmic framework without glorifying conflict as an independent value. Infrastructure projects further illustrate how social organization relied on mythologically informed cooperation. Large-scale construction, including irrigation works and monumental architecture, required coordinated labor across communities. Participation in such projects was framed as service to both the state and the maintained order of the world. Mythological concepts provided a rationale for collective labor, transforming obligation into participation within a meaningful system. Archaeological evidence of standardized labor organization supports this interpretation. Education and training reinforced these patterns. Scribes and administrators were instructed in language, ritual, and administrative procedure, ensuring consistency across institutions. Instructional texts emphasize proper conduct and adherence to established norms. Mythological language within these texts frames obedience and competence as alignment with order rather than personal advancement. This educational system supported continuity by reproducing institutional values across generations. Social mobility, while limited, operated within this framework. Advancement depended on service to institutions aligned with state and religious authority. Individuals who demonstrated competence and loyalty could attain positions within administration or priesthood. Mythological concepts legitimized such mobility by framing success as recognition of proper alignment rather than challenge to hierarchy. This dynamic reinforced stability by allowing controlled adaptation without structural disruption. The integration of mythology into social and political organization thus extended beyond elite ideology into practical governance. Religious concepts were enacted through institutions, labor organization, and daily ritual. Authority was maintained through participation rather than constant enforcement. Social hierarchy was presented as functional and necessary within an ordered system sustained by collective effort. These early structures established patterns that would persist throughout Egyptian history. By grounding political organization in mythological interpretation, early Egyptian society created a durable system capable of managing complexity and change. Social order was maintained through shared understanding embedded in practice. This framework provided continuity across periods of expansion and contraction, shaping how Egyptian civilization would respond to internal development and external contact. Religious belief in ancient Egypt was structured around the assumption that the cosmos operated according to an enduring and maintainable order. This order was not self-sustaining, but required continuous reinforcement through ritual practice and correct behavior. Egyptian mythology provided the conceptual framework through which this maintenance was understood. Rather than functioning as narrative entertainment, mythological concepts articulated the relationships between divine forces, natural phenomena, and human responsibility. Religious practice was therefore oriented toward preservation rather than transformation. Central to this system was the idea that stability depended upon proper alignment between human activity and divine function. Ritual performance was understood as a practical mechanism for sustaining balance within the cosmos. Offerings, prayers, and ceremonial observance were not symbolic gestures, but functional acts believed to produce tangible effects. The repetition of ritual ensured continuity, reinforcing the perception that order could be preserved through disciplined practice. Mythology explained why these actions were necessary by classifying divine roles and responsibilities rather than recounting episodic events. Deities within this framework embodied specific functions rather than individualized personalities. Each god or goddess represented a domain of activity, such as fertility, protection, transition, or judgment. These domains corresponded to observable aspects of the natural and social world. Divine figures were therefore integrated into daily experience through their association with agricultural cycles, social institutions, and life stages. Mythological language defined how these forces interacted, establishing an intelligible system through which events could be interpreted. Burial practices offer particularly clear evidence of how these beliefs shaped behavior. Death was not conceived as a rupture separating existence into distinct realms, but as a transition requiring regulation. The continuation of existence depended upon successful navigation of divine processes governed by established principles. Funerary ritual was therefore a necessary extension of religious practice rather than a response to loss alone. Mythological concepts provided the framework through which death was understood as manageable and ordered. The preparation of the body illustrates this orientation. Preservation of physical form through mummification reflected the belief that continuity required material stability. The body was not discarded, but maintained as a necessary component of posthumous existence. This practice demonstrates the integration of religious belief with technical procedure. Embalming was conducted according to standardized methods, indicating institutional oversight and shared understanding of its significance. Mythology explained the necessity of preservation by classifying bodily integrity as essential to continued participation in order. Tomb construction further reinforces this perspective. Burial spaces were designed as functional environments equipped for ongoing existence. Tombs contained provisions, tools, and representations of daily activity, reflecting the assumption that posthumous life followed recognizable patterns. These inclusions were not symbolic memorials, but practical requirements grounded in religious belief. Mythological concepts articulated the conditions under which such continuity could be achieved. Mortuary texts provide additional insight into religious classification of death. These texts did not narrate mythic stories, but presented formulaic utterances intended to activate protection and transformation. Their placement within burial contexts indicates that written language was understood as operational rather than descriptive. Correct recitation and inscription were believed to facilitate alignment with divine processes. Mythology, thus, functioned through precise expression rather than narrative elaboration. Over time, access to these practices expanded. Initially concentrated among royal and elite contexts, funerary rituals became increasingly available to broader segments of society. This expansion reflects shifts in religious participation rather than fundamental theological change. Core assumptions regarding order, continuity, and divine regulation remained consistent. What changed was the social distribution of ritual resources. The persistence of these beliefs across periods of political change underscores their foundational role. Religious practice adapted to new circumstances without abandoning its underlying structure. Burial customs evolved in form while preserving essential functions. Egyptian mythology therefore operated as a stable interpretive system capable of accommodating variation. Through ritual and material practice, belief was enacted repeatedly, reinforcing continuity across generations. The internal structure of Egyptian beliefs concerning the human being further shaped funerary practice and religious interpretation. Existence was understood as composed of multiple interrelated components rather than a single unified soul. These components functioned together to sustain identity and continuity beyond death. Religious practice focused on preserving and reactivating this complex structure through ritual intervention. Mythology provided the classificatory framework that defined how these elements interacted with divine forces. The physical body remained central to this system. Preservation through mummification ensured that the body retained recognizability and integrity. This process was not symbolic, but functional, grounded in the belief that bodily form was required for continued participation in ordered existence. Damage or decay threatened continuity, making careful preparation essential. The technical precision of embalming reflects institutional knowledge transmitted through specialized practitioners. Religious belief and technical practice were inseparable in this context. Other components of existence required ritual support. These aspects were understood as mobile and vulnerable, capable of separation without proper regulation. Funerary rituals addressed this risk by providing guidance, protection, and sustenance. Offerings of food, drink, and goods were not commemorative gestures, but practical provisions. Tomb inscriptions often specified quantities and types of offerings, reflecting an administrative approach to posthumous maintenance. Mythological concepts defined these requirements as necessary conditions rather than optional expressions. Judgment after death formed another central aspect of belief. Posthumous evaluation was conceived as a process governed by established principles rather than arbitrary decree. Correct conduct during life influenced outcomes, but ritual preparation remained essential. Funerary texts addressed this process by providing standardized utterances intended to ensure successful passage. These texts did not describe judgment in narrative terms, but outlined procedures and conditions. Mythology thus framed judgment as an ordered process subject to regulation. The spatial organization of tombs reflects these beliefs. Burial chambers were arranged to facilitate ritual action and containment. Placement of texts, amulets, and offerings followed established conventions. Orientation within the tomb often corresponded to cardinal directions associated with stability and transition. Such arrangements demonstrate the integration of cosmological assumptions into physical space. Religious belief shaped architecture as a functional environment rather than a symbolic representation. Variation in burial practice reveals adaptation within continuity. Differences in tomb complexity and material investment reflect social status and economic capacity. However, core ritual elements remained consistent across contexts. Even modest burials incorporated standardized forms of protection and provision. This consistency indicates that mythological classification applied universally, regardless of social position. Expansion of access did not alter foundational beliefs, but extended participation. Regional variation also influenced burial customs. Local traditions emphasized specific protective devices or ritual formulas, reflecting regional cult practices. These variations did not contradict broader religious frameworks, but operated within them. Shared mythological assumptions allowed for localized expression without fragmentation. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that funerary practice accommodated diversity while maintaining conceptual coherence. Political influence shaped religious emphasis during different periods. State-sponsored cults promoted particular deities and ritual forms, influencing funerary practice through institutional authority. Yet individual burial customs retained flexibility. Personal names, amulets, and inscriptions reflect selective engagement with state theology. Mythology functioned as a shared resource from which individuals and institutions drew according to circumstance. Changes over time illustrate the adaptability of this system. The increased prominence of certain funerary texts and symbols reflects shifting theological focus rather than abandonment of earlier belief. New ritual forms were layered onto existing practices, preserving continuity through accumulation. This process demonstrates how mythology functioned as an evolving classification system rather than a fixed doctrine. Religious belief in ancient Egypt therefore operated through practical application. Burial practices embodied mythological assumptions through repeated action, material preparation, and spatial organization. Continuity depended on correct performance rather than intellectual assent. Through ritual, belief was enacted as maintenance of order beyond death. This approach allowed religious concepts to persist across centuries, adapting to social and political change while retaining structural integrity. The long-term development of Egyptian burial practices demonstrates how religious belief was sustained through continuity of ritual rather than adherence to fixed doctrine. As theological emphasis shifted across periods, funerary customs absorbed new elements while preserving core assumptions about order, preservation, and regulation. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that innovation occurred through accumulation rather than replacement. Older practices were rarely abandoned outright, but were reinterpreted within expanded frameworks of belief. One of the most significant developments was the increasing accessibility of funerary texts and ritual knowledge. During earlier periods, complex mortuary inscriptions were largely restricted to royal contexts. Over time, these texts appeared in non-royal burials, reflecting broader participation in religious practice. This expansion did not democratize belief in a modern sense, but extended ritual tools to a wider segment of society. Mythological concepts governing posthumous existence remained consistent, while social boundaries surrounding ritual use shifted. Material culture reflects this change clearly. Coffins became primary carriers of religious text and imagery, transforming burial containers into ritual surfaces. Decorative programs incorporated protective symbols, standardized formulas, and visual representations aligned with established cosmological principles. These elements functioned as integrated systems rather than isolated motifs. Their repetition across burials indicates shared understanding of their purpose. Mythology operated through these forms as an applied system, guiding transformation and preservation. The role of ritual specialists remained central throughout these developments. Priests, embalmers, and scribes maintained authority over funerary practice through control of knowledge and technique. Training emphasized accuracy and consistency, reinforcing belief through proper execution. Errors were understood to compromise effectiveness rather than symbolism. This emphasis on precision highlights the practical orientation of religious belief. Mythology defined procedures that required correct performance to achieve desired outcomes. Political change influenced burial practice by altering institutional support. Periods of strong centralized authority promoted standardized funerary forms aligned with state theology. Conversely, during times of fragmentation, local traditions gained prominence. Despite these shifts, fundamental assumptions regarding continuity and order persisted. Burial practice adapted to institutional context without losing conceptual coherence. Mythology functioned as a flexible framework capable of accommodating political variability. Interaction with external cultures introduced additional complexity. Contact with Nubian, Levantine, and later Mediterranean traditions resulted in selective incorporation of foreign elements. Certain symbols, materials, and artistic techniques were adopted into funerary contexts. However, these elements were integrated into existing ritual systems rather than replacing them. Foreign influence was interpreted through Egyptian classification, preserving internal logic. Burial practice thus illustrates how mythology absorbed external pressure without structural disruption. Late-period developments demonstrate further adaptation. Increased emphasis on personal piety and protective devices reflects changing social conditions. Amulets, inscriptions, and ritual texts proliferated in both elite and non-elite contexts. These practices indicate heightened concern with individual protection within an enduring cosmological framework. Mythological concepts continued to define conditions of success, while ritual expression became more personalized. The gradual decline of traditional burial practices during late antiquity reflects institutional change rather than immediate theological collapse. Reduced temple support and changing administrative priorities affected ritual infrastructure. Nevertheless, continuity persisted in modified forms. Elements of funerary belief survived through adaptation, reinterpretation, and transmission into new cultural contexts. Archaeological evidence demonstrates gradual transformation rather than abrupt discontinuity. Religious belief and burial practice in ancient Egypt were therefore inseparable from material action. Mythology functioned as a system of classification that defined how existence was maintained across transitions. Burial rituals enacted these principles through preservation, provision, and regulation. Continuity depended on sustained practice rather than narrative transmission. This orientation allowed belief to persist across long chronological spans while accommodating social, political, and cultural change. The study of burial practices thus provides insight into the operational nature of Egyptian mythology. Religious belief was realized through repeated engagement with ritual forms embedded in material culture. Through these practices, order was extended beyond death as a regulated process rather than an unknown state. This framework would later interact with external religious systems while retaining its foundational emphasis on continuity and maintenance. Migration within the Nile Valley itself remained limited throughout much of Egyptian history due to the geographic constraints imposed by the surrounding deserts. Settlement patterns were largely stable, with communities remaining anchored to established agricultural zones along the riverbanks. This stability reduced internal demographic disruption and allowed cultural traditions, including religious frameworks, to persist with relatively little alteration. However, Egypt was never isolated. External movement across its borders introduced pressures that shaped religious interpretation over time. Trade routes connected Egypt to neighboring regions from an early period. Southern routes linked the Nile Valley to Nubia, providing access to gold, ivory, and exotic materials. Eastern routes connected Egypt to the Levant, facilitating exchange of goods, technologies, and symbolic motifs. Maritime connections through the Mediterranean expanded during later periods, introducing additional cultural contact. These interactions did not result in large-scale population replacement, but created sustained points of contact through which ideas and materials circulated. Religious development responded to these exchanges through selective adaptation. Foreign materials used in ritual contexts were incorporated into established symbolic systems rather than redefining them. Objects such as imported incense, metals, and decorative elements acquired religious significance through Egyptian classification. Mythology provided the framework through which external elements were interpreted. Rather than introducing new cosmological structures, foreign influences were mapped onto existing divine functions. Periods of political fragmentation intensified the impact of external pressures. During the First and Second Intermediate periods, centralized authority weakened and regional administrations gained autonomy. This shift altered patterns of religious emphasis. Local cults became more prominent as communities relied increasingly on regional institutions. Deities associated with specific locations or protective functions gained visibility within ritual practice. Mythological systems adapted by emphasizing accessibility and local relevance without abandoning core assumptions about order. Environmental stress also contributed to these changes. Variability in Nile flooding, combined with political instability, created uncertainty within agricultural and social systems. In response, religious practice emphasized protection and continuity at the individual and communal levels. Rituals focused on safeguarding households, livelihoods, and posthumous security. Funerary practices became more widely accessible, reflecting increased concern with continuity beyond death. Mythology framed these responses as necessary adjustments within an enduring system. The expansion of funerary texts during periods of instability illustrates this adaptation. Texts previously limited to elite contexts appeared in broader social use, indicating a shift in religious participation. These texts did not alter theological principles, but extended ritual tools to address changing social conditions. Mythological concepts governing transformation and protection remained consistent, while access to their application expanded. External military pressure further influenced religious interpretation. Border regions experienced increased contact with foreign groups during periods of weakened central control. These encounters reinforced perceptions of threat associated with liminal spaces. Religious symbolism associated with protection, boundary maintenance, and order gained prominence. Deities linked to defense and transition were invoked more frequently in ritual contexts. Mythology, thus, responded to external pressure by re-emphasizing functions related to stability. Despite these influences, religious continuity was maintained through institutional resilience. Temples and priesthoods adapted to changing circumstances by adjusting ritual emphasis rather than restructuring belief. Core cosmological principles continued to frame interpretation of events. External pressure was understood as a condition requiring management rather than a catalyst for transformation. Mythology functioned as an interpretive system capable of absorbing stress without fragmentation. Migration and external contact therefore influenced Egyptian mythology indirectly. Rather than producing sudden change, these pressures prompted shifts in emphasis within an established framework. Religious practice responded pragmatically to altered conditions while preserving foundational assumptions. Through selective adaptation, mythology remained coherent across periods of stability and disruption. These dynamics would become increasingly significant as Egypt entered phases of imperial expansion and sustained foreign rule. The interaction between external movement and internal stability produced a religious environment in which continuity was maintained through reinterpretation rather than resistance. Although Egypt experienced limited permanent migration, the presence of foreign individuals within administrative, military, and commercial contexts increased over time. These populations did not displace existing social structures, but operated within them. Religious interpretation adjusted to account for this presence by situating foreign elements within established cosmological classifications. Trade settlements and frontier zones functioned as points of sustained contact. In these areas, Egyptian religious practice encountered alternative symbolic systems through everyday interaction rather than doctrinal exchange. Objects of foreign origin entered temple inventories and funerary assemblages, acquiring ritual significance through contextual use. Their value lay not in their foreign associations, but in their integration into Egyptian practice. Mythology absorbed these materials by assigning them functional roles aligned with existing divine domains. Political fragmentation heightened the visibility of regional identity. During the intermediate periods, reduced central oversight allowed local traditions to gain prominence. Regional cult centers expanded their influence, and local deities assumed broader roles. This process did not fragment mythology, but diversified its expression. Shared cosmological principles provided coherence, while localized emphasis addressed immediate social conditions. Religious interpretation became more responsive to regional experience without abandoning systemic unity. Environmental pressures amplified this responsiveness. Periods of inconsistent flooding disrupted agricultural planning and resource distribution. Communities confronted increased uncertainty regarding sustenance and survival. Religious practice adapted by intensifying rituals associated with protection, renewal, and continuity. Household-level religious expression became more prominent, supplementing temple-centered ritual. Mythology framed these developments as necessary adjustments within a maintained order rather than deviations from tradition. The expansion of protective devices reflects this shift. Amulets, household shrines, and portable ritual objects became more common across social strata. Archaeological evidence indicates widespread use of such items during periods of instability. These practices did not introduce new theological concepts, but emphasized existing ones. Protection, regulation, and continuity remained central themes. Mythology functioned as a resource for managing uncertainty through practical means. Funerary practice also adapted in response to external pressure. Increased accessibility to burial texts and ritual equipment reflects heightened concern with posthumous security. These developments correspond with periods of political and environmental stress. The expansion of funerary resources indicates that religious participation broadened during uncertainty. Mythological classification remained unchanged, but ritual application became more inclusive. This pattern demonstrates how belief responded to social conditions without structural alteration. Military activity at Egypt's borders further influenced religious emphasis. Defensive campaigns and border management brought sustained contact with foreign populations. Religious symbolism associated with boundaries, protection, and transition became more pronounced. Temples in frontier regions emphasized deities linked to guardianship and stability. These shifts reflect practical concerns rather than theological innovation. Mythology provided a vocabulary for interpreting external threat within an established system. Institutional religion adapted through flexibility rather than rigidity. Temples adjusted ritual schedules, emphasized particular deities, and incorporated new materials while preserving core practices. Priesthoods maintained continuity through training and textual preservation. This adaptability allowed religious institutions to remain relevant during changing conditions. Mythology functioned as an interpretive framework capable of accommodating variation without losing coherence. The cumulative effect of migration patterns and external pressures was therefore incremental rather than transformative. Religious interpretation evolved through emphasis and application rather than conceptual restructuring. Egypt's relative demographic stability allowed mythology to absorb external influence gradually. External contact prompted selective incorporation, guided by internal classification rather than imitation. These processes demonstrate the resilience of Egyptian mythology. By framing external pressure as a condition to be managed within an ordered system, religious practice maintained continuity across periods of instability. Migration and contact influenced how mythology was practiced rather than what it defined. This distinction allowed belief to remain structurally intact while adapting to changing circumstances. External pressures would later intensify, but the mechanisms developed during earlier periods provided a foundation for continued adaptation. As Egypt entered periods of sustained interaction beyond its traditional borders, the cumulative impact of external pressures became more visible in religious organization and emphasis. While earlier contact had been episodic and largely economic, later phases involved prolonged military presence, diplomatic engagement, and administrative oversight in foreign territories. These conditions required religious frameworks capable of addressing expanded spatial awareness without undermining established cosmological order. Mythology continued to function as a system for interpreting change through continuity. Imperial expansion during the Middle and New Kingdoms brought Egyptian administration into direct contact with foreign populations. Garrisons, trade enclaves, and colonial centers emerged in Nubia and the Levant. Egyptian religious practice accompanied these expansions through temple construction and ritual observance. Deities associated with kingship, protection, and territorial stability were emphasized in these contexts. Religious symbolism framed expansion as the extension of order into peripheral regions, rather than the transformation of core identity. Foreign presence within Egypt also increased during these periods. Captives, mercenaries, craftsmen, and administrators from neighboring regions were incorporated into the state system. Their presence introduced cultural diversity without displacing established structures. Religious practice responded by reinforcing shared ritual frameworks that emphasized participation over origin. Mythology provided categories through which foreign individuals could be integrated as functional participants within an ordered system. Periods of imperial contraction further tested religious adaptability. Loss of territory and influence required reinterpretation of events within existing frameworks. Religious practice emphasized restoration and maintenance rather than expansion. Deities associated with renewal, protection, and continuity gained prominence. Ritual language framed decline as a temporary disruption requiring corrective action rather than evidence of cosmic failure. Mythology, thus, provided a means of preserving coherence amid changing political circumstances. Environmental factors continued to interact with these pressures. Variability in climate and resource availability affected agricultural production and population stability. Religious emphasis on regulation and protection intensified during such periods. Ritual calendars were adjusted to address perceived instability. Mythology interpreted environmental fluctuation as a condition requiring reinforcement of established practices rather than reinterpretation of natural order. The incorporation of foreign symbols during later periods illustrates selective adaptation under pressure. Certain iconographic elements and materials were adopted into religious contexts, particularly in regions of sustained contact. These elements were not integrated as independent systems, but were reclassified within Egyptian symbolic language. Foreign gods were occasionally identified with Egyptian deities through functional equivalence. This process preserved internal coherence while allowing religious practice to remain responsive to cultural interaction. Institutional resilience played a critical role in managing these pressures. Temples functioned as centers of continuity, preserving ritual schedules, texts, and training systems. Even as political authority fluctuated, temple institutions maintained religious practice through localized support. Priesthoods adapted emphasis while preserving foundational assumptions. Mythology continued to operate as an applied system rather than a theoretical construct, grounding interpretation in ritual action. Late-period developments further illustrate gradual transformation. Increased foreign governance introduced new administrative languages and legal systems, but religious practice retained its conservative orientation. Sacred language and ritual forms persisted within temple contexts despite external control. This separation allowed mythology to endure beyond political independence. Archaeological evidence demonstrates continued ritual activity even as institutional support diminished. The long-term effect of migration patterns and external pressures was therefore cumulative and adaptive. Rather than producing abrupt theological change, these influences prompted shifts in emphasis, accessibility, and application. Mythology functioned as a stabilizing interpretive framework that absorbed external influence without structural collapse. Its resilience lay in its capacity to classify change within an ordered system grounded in practice. Through selective incorporation and emphasis adjustment, Egyptian religious belief remained coherent across centuries of interaction and pressure. Migration and contact shaped how mythology was lived rather than redefining its foundations. This capacity for adaptation would prove essential as Egypt entered prolonged periods of foreign rule and cultural exchange, setting the conditions for further transformation while preserving continuity. Egyptian mythology developed within a cultural environment that, while geographically bounded, remained in continuous contact with surrounding regions. Interaction with neighboring peoples occurred through trade, diplomacy, migration, and military activity, creating sustained opportunities for religious exchange. These interactions did not undermine the internal coherence of Egyptian belief, but shaped how mythological systems were articulated and applied. Rather than adopting foreign religions wholesale, Egyptian practice relied on processes of identification and equivalence that preserved internal structure while accommodating external presence. From the early dynastic period onward, Egypt maintained contact with Nubia to the south and the Levant to the northeast. These regions provided resources unavailable within the Nile Valley, including metals, timber, incense, and luxury goods. Trade networks facilitated not only material exchange, but also symbolic exposure. Objects associated with foreign religious practice entered Egyptian ritual contexts through trade, where they were reinterpreted according to existing classifications. Mythology provided the framework for assigning meaning to these materials without importing foreign cosmologies. Diplomatic interaction further contributed to religious contact. Treaties, marriages, and gift exchange brought foreign elites into Egyptian court culture. These individuals encountered Egyptian religious practice within ceremonial and administrative settings. Egyptian mythology framed such encounters by emphasizing functional roles rather than ethnic origin. Deities associated with protection, legitimacy, and continuity were invoked to incorporate foreign presence into an ordered system. Religious ritual thus mediated political interaction by providing shared symbolic language. The process of theological equivalence was central to this mediation. Egyptian religious thought classified deities according to function rather than exclusive identity. When foreign gods were encountered, their attributes were compared to those of existing Egyptian deities. Through this comparison, foreign gods could be identified as alternative expressions of familiar functions. This practice allowed for recognition without displacement. Egyptian deities retained primacy within the system, while foreign gods were incorporated as functional counterparts. Archaeological evidence supports this process. Inscriptions and iconography occasionally depict foreign deities alongside Egyptian gods, often labeled with explanatory titles. These representations do not suggest doctrinal synthesis, but functional alignment. The foreign god's role is clarified through Egyptian terminology, situating it within an established framework. Mythology thus operated as a classificatory system capable of accommodating external religious concepts without restructuring core beliefs. Imperial expansion during the New Kingdom intensified these interactions. Egyptian military campaigns and administrative control extended into Nubia and the Levant, bringing Egyptian religious practice into sustained contact with foreign populations. Temples were constructed in occupied territories, replicating Egyptian ritual space beyond the Nile Valley. These temples served administrative as well as religious functions, reinforcing political authority through familiar religious forms. Mythological frameworks were exported alongside governance, presenting imperial expansion as the extension of order. In these frontier contexts, Egyptian religious practice adapted to local conditions. While temple architecture and ritual schedules followed Egyptian models, local populations participated in varying degrees. Egyptian deities associated with kingship and protection were emphasized, reflecting the needs of imperial administration. Foreign religious symbols occasionally appeared within these temples, incorporated through equivalence rather than replacement. This selective integration maintained Egyptian cosmological coherence while acknowledging local presence. Conversely, foreign influence entered Egypt through sustained contact. Artistic motifs, materials, and ritual practices from neighboring cultures were adopted into Egyptian contexts. These elements were not introduced as foreign systems, but were reinterpreted within Egyptian symbolic language. The persistence of Egyptian religious classification ensured that new forms were subsumed under existing categories. Mythology thus mediated cultural exchange by regulating interpretation. Throughout these interactions, Egyptian mythology demonstrated resilience through adaptability. External contact prompted reinterpretation rather than abandonment. By emphasizing functional equivalence and ritual continuity, Egyptian religious systems maintained internal coherence while engaging with diverse cultures. These mechanisms allowed mythology to persist as a stable interpretive framework amid extensive interaction with neighboring peoples and empires. The New Kingdom represents the period in which interaction between Egyptian mythology and external cultures reached its greatest institutional scale. As Egypt established sustained control over territories in Nubia and the Levant, religious practice became an integral component of imperial administration. Mythological systems were not only preserved within Egypt, but deliberately projected outward as instruments of governance. Temples, ritual calendars, and divine imagery accompanied military garrisons and administrative centers, embedding Egyptian cosmological order within foreign landscapes. Temple construction in imperial territories followed recognizable Egyptian patterns. Sacred precincts were aligned according to Egyptian architectural conventions, incorporating courtyards, pylons, and sanctuaries arranged along axial plans. These structures created spatial continuity between the Nile Valley and peripheral regions. Ritual activity conducted within them followed Egyptian calendars and liturgies, reinforcing familiarity for administrators and soldiers stationed abroad. Mythology functioned here as a stabilizing presence, framing imperial rule as an extension of established order rather than foreign domination. In Nubia, Egyptian deities were introduced alongside local traditions. Rather than suppressing indigenous religious practice, Egyptian administration often incorporated local deities through equivalence. Nubian gods were identified with Egyptian counterparts based on perceived functional similarity. This practice allowed local populations to participate in imperial religious life without abandoning their traditions entirely. Mythology provided a flexible system through which multiple identities could be integrated under a shared cosmological framework. The Levant presented a different context, characterized by long-established urban cultures and complex political networks. Egyptian presence in this region involved diplomacy as well as military control. Religious exchange occurred through elite interaction, treaty ritual, and shared ceremonial practices. Egyptian gods associated with kingship, protection, and legitimacy were emphasized in diplomatic contexts. Inscriptions and reliefs depict Egyptian rulers invoking divine authority in foreign settings, reinforcing the connection between mythology and political order. Foreign iconographic elements entered Egyptian art during this period, reflecting sustained exposure to neighboring cultures. Motifs related to dress, weaponry, and decorative style appear in temple reliefs and ritual objects. These elements were incorporated selectively and recontextualized within Egyptian symbolic language. Their adoption did not signal acceptance of foreign theology, but reflected adaptation at the level of representation. Mythology continued to define meaning through established categories despite visual change. The identification of foreign deities with Egyptian gods intensified during periods of close political contact. Deities associated with storms, fertility, or warfare were aligned with Egyptian figures performing similar functions. This alignment did not require theological synthesis, but relied on functional correspondence. Egyptian religious classification allowed such identifications without compromising internal coherence. Foreign gods could be acknowledged while remaining subordinate to Egyptian cosmological order. Periods of foreign rule within Egypt itself further illustrate these dynamics. Libyan and Nubian rulers adopted Egyptian religious forms to legitimize authority. Temple inscriptions from these periods emphasize continuity with earlier tradition. Rulers presented themselves as participants in maintaining order rather than innovators. Mythology provided the language through which foreign dynasties could integrate into Egyptian political culture without redefining religious structure. The Persian period introduced administrative changes that affected religious institutions, yet Egyptian mythology persisted through adaptation. Temples continued to operate, and ritual practice remained grounded in traditional frameworks. Persian rulers engaged with Egyptian religion selectively, supporting temple institutions to maintain stability. Religious continuity was preserved through institutional resilience rather than political independence. Greek rule following the conquest of Egypt introduced new modes of interaction. Greek settlers encountered Egyptian mythology through temples, priesthoods, and monumental art. Processes of equivalence intensified as Greek and Egyptian gods were identified with one another. This syncretism reflected mutual adaptation rather than dominance. Egyptian deities continued to function within their established roles while acquiring additional interpretive layers. Throughout these periods, Egyptian mythology demonstrated a capacity to absorb and reinterpret external influence without structural collapse. Interaction with neighboring peoples and empires altered expression and emphasis, but preserved foundational principles. Mythology functioned as a durable framework capable of mediating cultural exchange across shifting political landscapes. Later phases of Egyptian history further demonstrate how sustained interaction with foreign powers reshaped religious expression without dismantling underlying mythological structures. As political autonomy diminished and foreign governance became prolonged, Egyptian religious systems adapted by emphasizing continuity, classification, and reinterpretation. Mythology continued to function as an organizing framework through which external authority could be understood and accommodated within established cosmological assumptions. During periods of Libyan and Nubian rule, foreign elites adopted Egyptian religious forms to legitimize their authority. Royal titulary, temple patronage, and participation in ritual practice followed established conventions. Inscriptions from these periods emphasize maintenance of order rather than innovation. Foreign rulers presented themselves as successors within an existing system, drawing legitimacy from continuity with Egyptian tradition. Mythology provided the symbolic language necessary for this integration, allowing political change to be framed as preservation. The Persian period introduced administrative and legal systems distinct from Egyptian precedent, yet religious institutions retained considerable autonomy. Temples continued to function as centers of ritual and economic activity. Priestly administration preserved liturgical schedules, training systems, and textual transmission. Mythological concepts remained embedded in daily ritual practice, demonstrating resilience through institutional continuity. Religious interpretation adjusted emphasis without altering foundational classification. Greek rule following the Macedonian conquest introduced a new cultural dynamic characterized by prolonged coexistence rather than brief occupation. Greek settlers established cities alongside traditional Egyptian settlements, creating parallel cultural environments. Interaction between Greek and Egyptian religious practice occurred through shared space and administrative necessity. Processes of equivalence intensified as Greek and Egyptian deities were identified with one another based on functional similarity. This identification did not erase Egyptian mythological structure. Egyptian deities retained their roles within established cosmology while acquiring additional interpretive associations. Temples continued to operate according to traditional ritual schedules, even as bilingual inscriptions appeared. Mythology functioned as a stable framework within which new associations could be accommodated. Syncretism reflected layered interpretation rather than replacement. The emergence of combined cults illustrates this process. Certain deities were presented through hybrid iconography and shared titles, facilitating participation by diverse populations. These cults did not dissolve Egyptian religious identity, but expanded its accessibility. Mythological classification allowed multiple interpretive layers to coexist. Religious meaning remained grounded in function and ritual practice rather than narrative coherence. Roman rule extended these dynamics further. Administrative control shifted, but religious practice persisted through localized support. Temples continued ritual activity despite reduced state patronage. Religious symbols appeared in domestic and communal contexts, indicating continued engagement beyond institutional decline. Mythology adapted to reduced public visibility by persisting through private practice and localized tradition. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals gradual transformation rather than abrupt cessation. Temple maintenance declined unevenly, reflecting regional variation in support. Some cult centers remained active for centuries, while others fell into disuse. Religious practice contracted spatially but retained conceptual coherence. Mythology continued to define interpretation of existence through continuity rather than innovation. The endurance of Egyptian mythology through successive periods of foreign interaction demonstrates the effectiveness of its classificatory structure. By defining deities through function and maintaining ritual practice as the primary mode of engagement, mythology remained adaptable to changing political conditions. External authority was interpreted within an existing system rather than requiring theological reconstruction. Interaction with neighboring peoples and empires therefore shaped Egyptian mythology through reinterpretation rather than transformation. Cultural exchange altered representation, emphasis, and accessibility while preserving internal logic. Mythology functioned as a stabilizing framework capable of absorbing external influence without fragmentation. Its resilience lay in its grounding in ritual practice and institutional continuity rather than narrative rigidity. These interactions reveal Egyptian mythology as a dynamic system oriented toward maintenance rather than exclusivity. Through equivalence, syncretism, and adaptation, religious belief persisted across shifting political landscapes. The capacity to integrate external elements while preserving internal structure allowed Egyptian mythology to endure well beyond periods of political independence, shaping its long historical legacy. The New Kingdom marked the period in which Egyptian territorial control, administrative capacity, and ideological integration reached their greatest extent. Political authority expanded beyond the Nile Valley into Nubia and the Eastern Mediterranean, supported by a centralized state apparatus capable of sustained military and economic organization. Within this context, mythology became fully embedded in mechanisms of governance, serving as a unifying framework that linked territorial expansion to cosmic order. Religious interpretation did not merely accompany political power, but structured how that power was understood and enacted. Statecraft during this period relied heavily on religious symbolism to articulate legitimacy. The ruler was presented as the active maintainer of order across an expanded world. Military success, territorial control, and resource extraction were framed as outcomes of proper alignment between human authority and divine function. Mythological concepts define the scope of political responsibility, presenting expansion as an extension of order rather than an act of disruption. Governance was thus interpreted through religious classification rather than pragmatic justification alone. Monumental architecture illustrates this integration clearly. Temples constructed during the New Kingdom reached unprecedented scale and complexity. These structures functioned as both religious and administrative centers, managing land, labor, and surplus while hosting elaborate ritual programs. Architectural design emphasized axial alignment, symmetry, and controlled movement, reinforcing cosmological principles through spatial experience. Mythology was embedded in stone, presenting order as tangible and enduring. Temple reliefs and inscriptions further demonstrate the ideological role of mythology. Scenes depicting ritual performance, divine interaction, and royal activity followed standardized conventions that emphasized timelessness rather than narrative sequence. The repetition of these scenes across temple complexes reinforced continuity. Deities were shown receiving offerings, endorsing authority, and participating in the maintenance of order. These representations did not recount specific events, but articulated functional relationships within an eternal system. Military ideology during the New Kingdom was similarly framed through religious interpretation. Campaigns beyond Egypt's borders were presented as acts of restoration and stabilization rather than conquest for its own sake. Deities associated with kingship and protection were invoked to legitimize military action. Victory was interpreted as evidence of maintained order, while resistance was framed as disruption requiring correction. Mythology thus provided a moral and cosmological framework that aligned military activity with religious duty. The expansion of cult centers during this period reflects increased institutional complexity. Major temples accumulated wealth, personnel, and influence, becoming powerful entities within the state. Priesthoods expanded in size and specialization, managing extensive resources and ritual schedules. This concentration of religious authority contributed to the standardization of mythological expression. While regional variation persisted, major cult centers exerted influence over theological emphasis and ritual practice across Egypt. State-sponsored rituals reinforced this integration. Large-scale festivals coordinated across regions synchronized religious observance with political authority. Participation in these rituals reinforced collective identity within an expanded territorial framework. Mythological concepts were enacted through public ceremony, making religious interpretation visible and communal. These events reinforced the perception of stability through repetition and scale. Theological complexity increased as a result of these developments. Deities acquired expanded titles and associations reflecting the broader scope of state activity. Mythological classification adapted to encompass imperial administration without abandoning foundational principles. Religious language expanded through accumulation, allowing deities to operate across multiple domains while retaining core functions. This flexibility supported ideological coherence amid territorial expansion. The New Kingdom thus represents a period in which mythology, politics, and material culture were fully integrated. Territorial consolidation was interpreted as the physical manifestation of maintained order. Religious frameworks provided the conceptual tools necessary to govern complexity without fragmentation. Through monumental architecture, ritual practice, and standardized representation, mythology articulated the relationship between expanded power and enduring stability. These developments established patterns that would define Egyptian religious identity, long after political conditions changed. The consolidation of territorial power during the New Kingdom coincided with the maturation of Egyptian theological systems, which became increasingly structured through institutional coordination. Major cult centers emerged as focal points of religious authority, shaping ritual practice, theological emphasis, and administrative integration. These centers did not replace earlier traditions, but organized them within expanded frameworks suitable for a territorially extensive state. Mythology functioned as a system of classification that allowed diverse religious expressions to coexist under centralized oversight. The prominence of specific cult centers reflected both political patronage and historical continuity. Temples associated with long-established deities accumulated resources and influence through royal support. These institutions managed extensive landholdings, employed large workforces, and coordinated ritual calendars that extended beyond local communities. Their theological perspectives gained wider recognition as a result of institutional reach rather than doctrinal enforcement. Mythological emphasis shifted toward deities whose functions aligned with state priorities, such as protection, legitimacy, and renewal. Standardization of religious expression increased during this period. Ritual language, iconography, and temple layout followed recognizable conventions across regions. This standardization did not eliminate local variation, but provided a shared framework within which it could operate. Local cults retained distinctive practices while adhering to broader ritual schedules and symbolic forms. Mythology accommodated diversity by defining functional relationships rather than enforcing uniform narrative content. Ritual practice played a central role in reinforcing this structure. Daily temple rituals followed precise sequences intended to sustain divine presence and order. These rituals were conducted by trained priesthoods whose roles were clearly delineated. The repetition of ritual action reinforced continuity, presenting religious maintenance as an ongoing process rather than an episodic event. Mythological concepts were enacted through performance, embedding belief within routine institutional activity. Public festivals further illustrate the integration of theology and state authority. Large-scale celebrations synchronized religious observance across communities, reinforcing collective participation in maintaining order. These events involved processions, offerings, and ceremonial display that made mythological concepts visible within public space. Participation reinforced identification with the state and its religious framework. Mythology functioned here as a shared interpretive system, linking individual communities to a broader territorial identity. Theological elaboration occurred through accumulation rather than revision. Deities acquired additional titles, roles, and associations reflecting expanded political and social contexts. These additions did not alter core functions, but extended applicability. Mythological language allowed for this expansion through flexible classification. Deities could operate simultaneously within local, regional, and national contexts without contradiction. This adaptability supported ideological coherence within an increasingly complex society. Textual production during the New Kingdom reflects this process. Religious texts expanded in volume and distribution, appearing on temple walls, stelae, and ritual objects. These texts emphasized formulaic expression rather than narrative innovation. Their purpose was functional, ensuring correct ritual execution and alignment with established principles. Mythology continued to operate through structured language designed for application rather than storytelling. The relationship between state authority and religious institutions was mutually reinforcing. Royal patronage supported temple expansion, while religious endorsement legitimized political power. This reciprocal relationship strengthened both systems. Mythological concepts provided a shared vocabulary through which authority and obligation were articulated. Governance was framed as participation in maintaining order rather than the imposition of control. Despite increasing complexity, the system remained grounded in earlier foundations. Environmental orientation, ritual repetition, and institutional continuity preserved coherence. New developments were integrated through reference to established principles rather than radical reinterpretation. Mythology functioned as an organizing framework capable of sustaining expansion without fragmentation. The peak period of Egyptian civilization, therefore, represents the culmination of long-term processes rather than a sudden transformation. Territorial consolidation was accompanied by theological refinement that emphasized standardization, integration, and continuity. Religious practice adapted to expanded scale while preserving core assumptions about order and maintenance. These developments solidified mythological forms that would persist as reference points in later periods, shaping how Egyptian religion was remembered and reinterpreted after political conditions changed. The culmination of territorial consolidation during the New Kingdom produced a religious environment in which mythological forms achieved lasting definition. As political power stabilized and administrative systems matured, religious expression increasingly emphasized preservation of established structures. Mythology during this period functioned less as a developing system and more as a reference framework against which continuity was measured. This stabilization contributed to the enduring legacy of New Kingdom religious forms in later historical memory. Monumental landscapes played a critical role in reinforcing this consolidation. Large temple complexes dominated urban and ritual centers, shaping daily experience through their physical presence. These structures organized movement, sightlines, and participation in ways that reinforced hierarchical order. Access to inner spaces was regulated, reflecting theological assumptions about proximity to divine presence. Mythological concepts were embedded in spatial arrangement, making religious order tangible and experiential rather than abstract. The accumulation of ritual knowledge within institutional contexts further contributed to stabilization. Priesthoods maintained extensive archives of ritual texts, hymns, and procedural instructions. Transmission emphasized accuracy and fidelity to precedent. Innovation occurred through addition rather than alteration, ensuring continuity of practice. Mythological language was preserved through repetition, reinforcing familiarity and authority. This conservatism ensured that religious meaning remained intelligible across generations. State ideology during this period relied on the visibility of religious order. Public monuments, reliefs, and inscriptions communicated stability through repetition of established forms. Deities were depicted in consistent relationships with royal authority, reinforcing functional roles rather than narrative development. These representations did not seek to persuade through argument, but through familiarity. Mythology functioned as a shared cultural grammar, understood through exposure rather than instruction. The relationship between military success and religious interpretation also stabilized. Campaigns were framed within established symbolic language, emphasizing restoration and defense of order. Ritual acknowledgement of divine support followed standardized forms. This consistency reduced the need for reinterpretation of events, reinforcing the perception that political activity operated within known parameters. Mythological classification provided predictability in interpretation, supporting ideological cohesion. Economic administration reinforced religious stability. Temple estates managed resources according to long-established practices. Redistribution, labor organization, and storage followed institutional norms integrated with ritual obligation. Religious festivals marked agricultural cycles, aligning economic activity with cosmological interpretation. Mythology framed prosperity as evidence of maintained order, reinforcing confidence in institutional continuity. Regional diversity continued within this stabilized system. Local cults maintained distinctive practices, but their integration into national ritual calendars and symbolic frameworks limited fragmentation. The balance between local expression and centralized oversight reflected mature administrative capacity. Mythology allowed for variation within defined boundaries, preserving unity without uniformity. The long-term effects of this consolidation became evident during subsequent periods of decline. Later generations referenced New Kingdom forms as standards of legitimacy and correctness. Temple inscriptions and religious texts from later periods often invoked earlier models, demonstrating the enduring authority of this phase. Mythology achieved a canonical quality, not through formal codification, but through institutional reinforcement and material permanence. This canonization did not prevent adaptation, but shaped its parameters. Later reinterpretations operated within frameworks established during the peak period. The durability of these forms reflects the success of New Kingdom integration. Mythology, architecture, ritual, and administration converged to produce a coherent system capable of sustaining identity beyond political fluctuation. The territorial and ideological peak of Egyptian civilization therefore represents a moment of consolidation rather than culmination. Religious forms achieved stability sufficient to endure subsequent transformation. Mythology functioned as an inherited structure through which later societies understood continuity and change. This period defined reference points that shaped Egyptian religious identity long after territorial control diminished. Through institutional maturity, architectural permanence, and ritual repetition, mythological systems reached a level of integration that allowed them to persist in memory and practice. The New Kingdom solidified patterns that would inform both preservation and adaptation in later eras. This consolidation established the conditions under which Egyptian mythology would confront decline, reinterpretation, and legacy in the centuries that followed. As Egypt entered later phases of its history, military conflict and shifting alliances became increasingly prominent features of political life. These developments placed sustained pressure on institutions that had previously supported territorial stability and centralized authority. Within this context, mythology continued to function as a framework for interpreting political change. Rather than collapsing in response to military challenge, religious belief adapted by reclassifying success and failure within established cosmological principles. Military activity in earlier periods had been framed as the extension of order beyond Egypt's borders. During later phases, however, warfare increasingly involved defense, containment, and negotiation rather than expansion. External threats from neighboring powers required reinterpretation of political outcomes. Mythology provided the language through which military success was understood as confirmation of divine support. Victory reinforced perceptions of maintained order, while defeat required explanation without undermining foundational belief. Royal inscriptions from periods of conflict emphasize divine endorsement of military action. Deities associated with kingship, protection, and strength were invoked to legitimize campaigns. Ritual observance accompanied military mobilization, reinforcing the perception that warfare operated within a regulated system. These practices did not change theological assumptions, but reaffirmed them. Mythology framed military effort as participation in maintaining order rather than an autonomous pursuit of power. As external pressures intensified, alliances became an important component of political strategy. Diplomatic relationships with foreign states required symbolic negotiation as well as practical agreement. Religious ritual accompanied treaty formation, framing alliances as stabilizing measures rather than concessions. Mythological language emphasized balance and restoration, presenting diplomacy as consistent with cosmological maintenance. This framing allowed political compromise to be integrated into religious interpretation. Shifts in power affected religious emphasis within Egypt itself. As certain regions gained or lost influence, the prominence of associated cults changed accordingly. Temples connected to politically favored centers received increased patronage, while others experienced decline. These shifts did not represent theological rejection, but reallocation of institutional support. Mythology, adapted by emphasizing deities, aligned with prevailing political conditions, while preserving broader cosmological structure. Periods of military loss required particularly careful reinterpretation. Loss of territory challenged earlier narratives of expansion and control. Religious interpretation responded by emphasizing endurance, restoration, and continuity rather than domination. Deities associated with renewal and protection gained prominence during such times. Ritual language framed setbacks as disruptions requiring correction rather than evidence of systemic failure. Mythology thus preserved coherence by reframing change within established categories. Archaeological evidence reflects these shifts through changes in temple investment and ritual emphasis. Some cult centers declined as resources diminished, while others adapted by emphasizing protective and local functions. Religious practice became more regionally focused as centralized authority weakened. This decentralization did not fragment belief, but diversified its expression. Mythological classification continued to provide shared reference points despite institutional contraction. Military conflict also influenced social participation in religious practice. Increased insecurity encouraged greater engagement with protective rituals and personal devotion. Amulets, household offerings, and localized cult activity became more prominent. These practices did not alter theological principles, but reflected changes in application. Mythology continued to define the conditions of order while accommodating new forms of engagement. The gradual nature of these developments distinguishes transformation from collapse. Religious belief adjusted through emphasis rather than abandonment. Core assumptions regarding order, divine function, and ritual efficacy remained intact. Mythology demonstrated resilience by providing interpretive tools capable of addressing uncertainty and loss without requiring fundamental revision. Military conflicts and shifting alliances therefore contributed to the reorientation of Egyptian religious life. Mythology continued to legitimize authority while adapting to altered political realities. Through reinterpretation, emphasis shift, and institutional adjustment, belief systems remained coherent amid decline. These processes set the conditions for further transformation as Egypt moved toward reduced autonomy and eventual incorporation into broader imperial systems. As military pressures accumulated, the relationship between political authority and religious institutions underwent gradual reconfiguration. The concentration of resources that had sustained large temple complexes and centralized ritual programs became increasingly difficult to maintain. This shift affected how mythology was enacted within institutional settings rather than how it was conceptualized. Religious interpretation adapted to reduced political capacity by redistributing emphasis across local and regional contexts. Declining territorial control altered patterns of state patronage. Temples that had once benefited from imperial wealth experienced reduced income and labor support. In response, religious institutions adjusted ritual scale and frequency while preserving essential functions. Daily rituals continued where possible, though public festivals and monumental construction declined. Mythology remained operational through continuity of practice, even as institutional visibility diminished. Alliances with foreign powers further complicated religious expression. Diplomatic accommodation required symbolic flexibility, particularly when foreign rulers exerted influence within Egyptian territory. Religious ritual accompanied treaty obligations and political submission, framing such arrangements as temporary measures within an ordered system. Mythological language emphasized endurance and correction rather than dominance. This framing allowed political compromise to be absorbed without theological disruption. The shifting balance of power influenced which deities received prominence. Cults associated with earlier imperial ideology declined as their institutional support weakened. At the same time, deities connected to protection, healing, and local stability gained increased attention. This reorientation reflects changing social needs rather than doctrinal change. Mythology accommodated these shifts by emphasizing different functional domains while preserving core cosmological structure. Regionalization of religious practice increased during periods of political fragmentation. Local temples and cult centers became primary points of religious engagement. These institutions adapted ritual emphasis to address immediate community concerns. Mythological concepts were applied to local contexts without losing connection to national tradition. Shared ritual language and iconography maintained coherence across regions despite reduced central coordination. Textual evidence from later periods reflects this shift. Religious inscriptions emphasize protection, endurance, and correct conduct rather than expansion or conquest. Formulaic expressions continued to reference established cosmological principles. The persistence of these forms demonstrates continuity of belief despite altered circumstances. Mythology functioned as a repository of meaning that could be drawn upon selectively to address changing conditions. Military defeat also affected perceptions of kingship. As rulers struggled to maintain authority, religious interpretation adjusted to emphasize the role of institutions rather than individual leaders. Temples and priesthoods increasingly represented continuity in the absence of strong centralized rule. Mythological language framed order as sustained through collective ritual rather than personal power. This shift reflects adaptation to political reality rather than theological innovation. Economic strain contributed to these changes. Reduced agricultural surplus and disrupted trade affected temple estates and administrative capacity. Religious institutions adapted by focusing on essential ritual functions and localized support. Mythology framed scarcity as a condition requiring correct observance rather than reinterpretation of natural order. This emphasis reinforced continuity through discipline rather than expansion. The cumulative effect of these developments was gradual transformation. Religious practice became more inwardly focused, emphasizing protection, maintenance, and continuity within constrained circumstances. Mythology continued to provide interpretive structure without requiring ideological revision. Its resilience lay in its capacity to operate across scales, from state-sponsored ritual to local observance. This period illustrates how decline did not equate to collapse. Egyptian mythology adapted to diminished political power by redistributing emphasis and adjusting institutional expression. Core assumptions regarding order, divine function, and ritual efficacy persisted. Military conflict and alliance reshaped the application of belief without dismantling its foundations. Through reinterpretation rather than rejection, mythology remained relevant amid uncertainty. Religious systems continued to structure understanding of authority, obligation, and continuity. These adaptive strategies allowed Egyptian belief to persist through prolonged decline, preparing the ground for further transformation under foreign dominance and changing cultural conditions. The later stages of Egyptian decline reveal how mythology continued to operate as a stabilizing interpretive system even as political autonomy eroded. Military defeats, shifting alliances, and external domination did not dismantle religious belief, but altered the conditions under which it was practiced. Mythology adapted by redefining the scale and locus of order, moving from imperial expression toward localized and institutional continuity. As centralized authority weakened further, royal power lost much of its earlier ideological dominance. Kingship remained symbolically important, but its practical capacity to enforce order diminished. Religious interpretation responded by decoupling cosmic maintenance from the effectiveness of individual rulers. Order was increasingly presented as sustained through collective ritual performance rather than royal action alone. Temples and priesthoods assumed greater symbolic responsibility for continuity, reinforcing institutional stability amid political uncertainty. Foreign intervention intensified these dynamics. As external powers asserted control, Egyptian rulers often functioned within constrained political frameworks. Religious language adapted to present such arrangements as conditions requiring endurance and ritual reinforcement. Mythology framed foreign dominance as a temporary disruption within a larger order rather than a fundamental reversal. This interpretation preserved conceptual coherence despite altered political realities. The redistribution of religious authority toward local contexts continued during this period. Communities relied more heavily on regional cults and household practices for religious engagement. Local temples addressed immediate concerns related to protection, health, and subsistence. Mythological concepts were applied pragmatically to everyday conditions rather than abstract state ideology. This shift reflects the flexibility of belief in responding to social needs without altering foundational structure. Ritual practice during decline emphasized repetition and correctness. With fewer resources available for monumental expression, religious continuity depended on maintaining established procedures. Even modest rituals followed traditional forms, reinforcing familiarity and authority. Mythology functioned through these practices as a lived system sustained by habit rather than spectacle. Continuity was preserved through action rather than institutional display. Textual transmission also adapted to these conditions. Religious texts continued to be copied and reused, often emphasizing protective and moral guidance. These texts reinforced proper conduct within an ordered system rather than promising political restoration. Mythological language framed personal behavior as participation in maintaining balance. This emphasis supported social cohesion during periods of external control and internal fragmentation. The decline of large-scale temple construction reflects reduced state capacity rather than loss of belief. Archaeological evidence indicates continued ritual activity within existing structures long after new construction ceased. Temples were maintained where possible, and sacred spaces retained significance. Mythology persisted through reuse and adaptation of material environments. Religious meaning was preserved through continuity of place, even as resources diminished. Foreign rulers often supported Egyptian religious institutions to maintain stability. This patronage allowed ritual practice to continue despite political subordination. Religious language framed such support as recognition of established order rather than external imposition. Mythology thus mediated the relationship between Egyptian society and foreign authority by providing a shared symbolic framework. The gradual nature of decline allowed for adaptation without rupture. Egyptian religious systems did not experience abrupt collapse, but transitioned through phases of contraction and reinterpretation. Mythology continued to define meaning through classification, ritual, and repetition. Its resilience lay in its orientation toward maintenance rather than transformation. By framing change as a condition to be managed, belief systems remained operational. By the end of this period, Egyptian mythology had shifted from an imperial ideology to a tradition sustained through institutional memory and localized practice. Military conflict and alliance reshaped how belief was enacted, but did not dismantle its core assumptions. Order continued to be defined as achievable through correct practice within constrained circumstances. This phase of decline, therefore, represents transformation through adaptation. Mythology provided continuity amid loss by redefining where and how order was maintained. Religious belief remained a functional system capable of structuring experience despite diminished political power. These developments set the stage for the final phase of Egyptian religious history, in which institutional support would further recede, while mythological legacy persisted in altered forms. The incorporation of Egypt into the Roman imperial system marked a decisive change in the institutional foundations that had long sustained Egyptian religious life. Political authority was reorganized under external administration, and the economic structures supporting temples and priesthoods were progressively reduced. This transformation did not immediately eliminate religious belief, but altered the conditions under which it could be practiced. Mythology entered a phase of contraction characterized by institutional decline rather than abrupt disappearance. Roman governance introduced administrative priorities that differed from earlier regimes. While earlier foreign rulers had often relied on Egyptian religious institutions to legitimize authority, Roman administration emphasized fiscal efficiency and centralized control. Temple estates, which had functioned as major economic units, lost land and labor privileges. Without sustained material support, many temples struggled to maintain daily ritual schedules. Religious practice became increasingly localized and uneven across regions. The decline of temple institutions affected priesthoods directly. Priests had long functioned as custodians of ritual knowledge, language, and tradition. As temple revenues diminished, training systems weakened and hereditary priestly lines fragmented. Some priesthoods adapted by reducing ritual scope or seeking alternative patronage, while others dissolved entirely. Mythological knowledge persisted among remaining practitioners, but lost the institutional mechanisms that had ensured uniform transmission. Archaeological evidence illustrates this gradual process. Temple complexes show signs of reduced maintenance, partial abandonment, and reuse of materials. Ritual inscriptions become less frequent, and large-scale construction ceases. These changes reflect economic and administrative realities rather than ideological rejection. Religious belief did not vanish, but operated within constrained material conditions. Mythology continued to exist as a conceptual framework, even as its public expression diminished. Religious transformation during this period involved reinterpretation rather than extinction. Some traditional practices were modified to align with new social realities. Ritual emphasis shifted toward personal devotion, protective practices, and localized observance. Household religion gained prominence as public institutions weakened. Mythological concepts governing protection, continuity, and regulation remained relevant, though enacted on a smaller scale. Interaction with Greco-Roman religious culture further shaped this transition. Egyptian deities were encountered by Greek and Roman populations through temples, art, and literature. Processes of equivalence and reinterpretation continued, allowing Egyptian gods to be identified with foreign counterparts. These identifications did not preserve Egyptian religious systems intact, but facilitated selective survival of mythological elements within new cultural frameworks. Literary and artistic transmission played a role in this survival. Egyptian religious imagery and symbolic concepts appeared in Greco-Roman art, philosophical discourse, and ritual practice. These representations often abstracted mythological elements from their original ritual context. Mythology persisted as symbolic reference rather than institutional system. This shift altered how religious meaning was experienced and understood. Despite institutional decline, certain temples remained active for centuries under Roman rule. These sites often benefited from local support or imperial tolerance. Ritual practice continued within them, albeit reduced in scale. The persistence of these centers demonstrates the durability of religious tradition when supported by community engagement. Mythology remained embedded in place and memory even as broader systems collapsed. The Roman period thus represents a transformation in scale and visibility rather than total disappearance. Egyptian mythology ceased to function as a state-supported system, but continued to inform religious expression through adaptation. Its decline was gradual, shaped by administrative change and cultural integration rather than suppression alone. This phase marks the beginning of mythology's transition from lived institutional practice to historical legacy. The foundations established over millennia allowed concepts, symbols, and classifications to persist beyond the structures that produced them. Understanding this process requires attention to continuity amid contraction, revealing how religious systems adapt when institutional support recedes. As institutional religious life contracted under Roman administration, Egyptian mythology increasingly persisted through cultural transmission rather than organized ritual continuity. The decline of temples and priesthoods did not erase mythological concepts, but altered the mechanisms through which they were preserved and reinterpreted. Religious knowledge migrated from formal institutional settings into artistic representation, literary reference, and philosophical discourse, allowing elements of Egyptian belief to survive beyond their original social framework. Art played a central role in this transformation. Egyptian religious imagery continued to appear in reliefs, sculpture, and decorative objects produced during the Roman period. These representations often retained traditional iconographic forms while being adapted to new artistic conventions. Deities were depicted with familiar attributes, preserving visual continuity even as ritual contexts diminished. Artifacts functioned as carriers of mythological memory, maintaining recognizable forms detached from active temple worship. Literary transmission further contributed to preservation. Greek and Roman authors encountered Egyptian mythology through travel, scholarship, and interaction with surviving priestly communities. Their writings recorded names, symbols, and religious concepts, though often filtered through external interpretive frameworks. These accounts did not preserve ritual practice, but documented mythological structures as objects of curiosity and philosophical reflection. Egyptian mythology thus entered broader intellectual discourse as a subject of study rather than lived tradition. Philosophical engagement represents another avenue of continuity. Certain Egyptian concepts related to cosmic order, transformation, and the relationship between material and immaterial existence resonated with Greco-Roman philosophical inquiry. Thinkers drew upon Egyptian symbolism to explore metaphysical questions, abstracting religious ideas from their ritual foundations. This process preserved conceptual elements while altering their function. Mythology persisted as symbolic language rather than operational belief. Religious syncretism intensified during this period. Egyptian deities were identified with Greek and Roman gods, facilitating incorporation into wider religious systems. These identifications often emphasized shared functions such as protection, healing, or fertility. While this process diluted distinctively Egyptian ritual practice, it allowed mythological figures to remain culturally relevant. Deities survived as components of composite religious identities rather than exclusive objects of worship. Esoteric traditions also absorbed Egyptian mythological elements. Symbolism associated with transformation, rebirth, and hidden knowledge appealed to emerging religious and philosophical movements. Egyptian imagery and terminology were incorporated into ritual texts and speculative frameworks removed from their original context. This transmission preserved mythological motifs while reassigning meaning. Mythology became a source of symbolic authority rather than communal practice. Despite these transformations, continuity remained uneven. Some regions maintained stronger connections to traditional religious practice than others. Local communities continued limited ritual observance at surviving temples, preserving elements of mythology through habitual use. These practices were often adapted to reduced resources and changing social conditions. Mythological concepts remained embedded in local identity even as broader institutional structures dissolved. Language change further influenced transmission. As spoken Egyptian evolved and eventually gave way to Coptic and later Arabic, mythological terminology required reinterpretation. Some concepts were translated into new linguistic frameworks, while others persisted through transliteration. This linguistic shift altered accessibility but did not entirely sever continuity. Mythology adapted through linguistic transformation rather than disappearance. The gradual loss of institutional support reshaped how mythology functioned within society. Religious belief ceased to organize public life comprehensively, but remained present in memory, art, and intellectual tradition. The shift from practice to representation altered legacy without eliminating influence. Mythology continued to shape perception of Egypt's past and identity long after active worship declined. This phase of transmission highlights the distinction between religious system and cultural memory. Egyptian mythology survived not as an intact tradition, but as a reservoir of symbols and ideas available for reinterpretation. Its persistence demonstrates the durability of conceptual frameworks developed over millennia. Even as temples closed and rituals ceased, mythology continued to inform artistic, philosophical, and symbolic expression across the Mediterranean world. The Roman period thus represents a transition from lived religious system to historical inheritance. Mythology remained present through adaptation and reinterpretation, shaping later thought while losing its original institutional form. This process laid the groundwork for Egypt's religious legacy to be understood not through practice alone, but through enduring cultural influence. The final phase of Egyptian mythology's historical trajectory is defined not by disappearance, but by transformation into a long-term cultural legacy. As active religious practice diminished, mythology became embedded within historical consciousness, scholarly tradition, and material inheritance. Its persistence depended on documentation, memory, and reinterpretation rather than ritual continuity. This transition marked a fundamental change in how Egyptian religious thought functioned within society. The extensive documentary record left by ancient Egypt played a decisive role in this legacy. Inscriptions, reliefs, papyri, and monumental architecture preserved religious language and symbolism long after temples ceased operation. These materials provided later cultures with access to mythological concepts in tangible form. Unlike many ancient religious systems preserved only through secondary accounts, Egyptian mythology remained accessible through original sources. This documentation ensured that religious ideas could be studied, reinterpreted, and transmitted beyond their original context. Greco-Roman scholarship contributed to this process by framing Egyptian religion as an object of antiquarian and philosophical interest. Writers described Egyptian gods, rituals, and cosmological concepts as part of a venerable ancient tradition. These accounts often emphasized age, continuity, and perceived wisdom rather than contemporary practice. Mythology was recast as evidence of an advanced ancient worldview, influencing how later societies understood Egypt's intellectual heritage. During late antiquity and the early medieval period, Egyptian mythological elements continued to circulate indirectly. Religious symbols, architectural motifs, and cosmological concepts appeared in art and literature detached from their original meanings. Egyptian themes were incorporated into broader symbolic systems, sometimes misunderstood but rarely forgotten. Mythology persisted as an interpretive resource rather than a living religious framework. The survival of Egyptian religious concepts was also shaped by their integration into emerging esoteric traditions. Symbolism associated with transformation, cycles, and hidden knowledge proved adaptable to speculative systems. Egyptian imagery was invoked to lend authority and antiquity to new ideas. While these uses often departed significantly from original context, they contributed to the continued visibility of Egyptian mythology within intellectual history. Archaeological rediscovery in later centuries further transformed legacy into scholarship. As ancient sites were explored and inscriptions deciphered, Egyptian mythology re-entered intellectual discourse as a subject of systematic study. Academic approaches reframed religious belief as historical phenomenon rather than theological truth. Mythology became a means of understanding ancient society, environment, and political organization. This scholarly engagement preserved continuity through analysis rather than practice. The coherence of Egyptian mythology contributed significantly to its endurance. Developed over millennia within a stable environmental and institutional framework, it exhibited internal consistency that allowed later interpretation. Classification of divine functions, ritual orientation, and cosmological structure remained intelligible even when detached from original practice. This coherence distinguished Egyptian mythology from more fragmented traditions. Its integration with social life further strengthened legacy. Religion in ancient Egypt permeated governance, economy, art, and daily routine. As a result, mythological concepts were embedded across material culture and administrative records. This integration ensured that mythology could not be isolated from broader historical study. Understanding Egyptian civilization required engagement with its religious frameworks. The decline of active worship did not negate significance. Instead, it shifted relevance from lived religion to historical exemplar. Egyptian mythology became a reference point for discussions of ancient cosmology, kingship, and ritual practice. Its longevity and documentation made it a foundational case study in the history of religion. In this sense, Egyptian mythology did not end but changed form. It transitioned from operative system to inherited tradition, from ritual practice to cultural memory. Its influence persisted through reinterpretation, scholarship, and symbolic use. The legacy of Egyptian mythology lies in its ability to remain intelligible and influential long after its institutional structures disappeared. This endurance reflects the cumulative strength of environmental grounding, institutional integration, and material preservation. Egyptian mythology remains one of the most extensively documented and continuously studied religious systems of the ancient world. Its historical significance lies not only in belief content, but in its capacity to shape understanding of how religion can function as a long-term organizing system within human society. The conclusion of Egyptian mythology as an active religious system did not occur through a single event or formal termination. It emerged gradually as the institutional structures that sustained ritual practice weakened and dissolved. Temples closed unevenly across regions, priestly lineages fragmented, and the administrative mechanisms that once coordinated religious life ceased to function. What remained was not absence, but residue, material, textual, and conceptual traces embedded in landscapes, objects, and inherited memory. Egyptian mythology had never existed solely as a collection of narratives. It functioned as a system of classification through which the world was organized and maintained. This system proved resilient precisely because it was embedded in practice rather than belief alone. When practice contracted, the system persisted in altered forms. Symbols remained legible, texts remained intelligible. Architectural forms continued to communicate order even when ritual use declined. Over time, mythology transitioned from lived structure to historical artifact. Its concepts were preserved through inscription and rediscovery rather than ritual repetition. Later cultures encountered Egyptian religious thought not as an operating system, but as a record of an ancient mode of understanding existence. Scholars, artists, and philosophers engaged with these materials to reconstruct meaning, situating mythology within broader studies of human history rather than communal worship. The historical legacy of Egyptian mythology lies in its duration and internal coherence. Developed over millennia within a stable environmental and social framework, it demonstrates how religious systems can function as long-term organizing principles. Its integration with governance, economy, and daily life provides a detailed case study of religion as a structural force rather than a private conviction. What survives today is not belief, but evidence. Texts, monuments, and material culture allow reconstruction of a system that once shaped perception of time, authority, death, and continuity. Egyptian mythology endures as a reference framework for understanding how societies articulate order and meaning across generations. With the completion of this account, the historical sequence reaches its end. The world that sustained Egyptian mythology no longer exists as it once did, yet its structures remain accessible through study, offering insight into the persistence and transformation of human systems of thought.